Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk to Abdullah Al-Andalusi. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much for inviting me on your show. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Absolute pleasure for me, sir. For those who don't know, Abdullah is an international speaker, thinker, and intellectual activist for Islam and Muslim affairs. He is a researcher for the I3 Institute, an instructor and head of the Department of Occidentology at the Quran Institute, and co-founder of the discussion forum, the Muslim Debate Initiative. For 20 years now, his work has been in explaining and demonstrating the intellectual proofs for the Islamic belief system, promoting the Islamic way of life and Islamic solutions for contemporary problems, and advocating for the rights of Muslims across the world. Abdullah has taught a number of courses and has given a variety of lectures at universities and colleges internationally. You can see many of these on YouTube, of course. But I think he's better known for his numerous TV appearances and public debates about more of which in a second. And tonight he will discuss the treatment of Muslims on right-wing channels and the right-wing position against Muslims, the recent events in Gaza, and the changing position of the political class in light of Israel's increasingly evident genocide. So let's drill down now in some more detail. And Abdullah will discuss key points Muslims need to know when advocating for Gaza and the Palestinians, especially in light of these four shows, these TV shows. You might have seen them just this week on Piers Morgan show. He's a British journalist guy. His show, the Piers Morgan Uncensored, as it's called, on Talk TV. This has had a huge impact, actually, on the media. So the first interview was with an English Muslim doctor called Dr. Abdul Wahid, and that was on the 11th of December. I assume you watched the Dr. Abdul Wahid interview?
Yes, I did with much interest.
Yeah, so did I. And now, what were your thoughts about the interview with him?
Well, predictably, I think it was a kind of a trap for Dr. Whitehead. They clearly had prepared in the kind of I forgot what they call the lower third titles. As soon as he came on, they say, extremist, exposed, and blah blah blah. Doctor. So they came on to basically make it a sensationalist piece and to attack him, to ask him things like, how could you be a doctor with these views? How can you expect anyone to even want to solicit your advice and your attention as in your profession as a doctor, knowing that you have these views, even though these views have nothing to do with how he practices. So
why is Dr. Abdul Wahid so controversial? Because he's been in the media quite a bit in the recent weeks, hasn't he?
Yes. So basically, Dr. Abdul Wahid is, I think, a senior member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is an international peaceful political party which calls for the re-establishment of the Khilafah, which is a unitary system of Muslims, the Muslims to be ruled under with one imam, which is as taught by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu and the Sahabas as they practiced. So to revive basically this practice that hasn't been implemented and established for over 100 years now.
So he's not calling, just to clarify, Abdul Wahid is not calling for the caliphate in the United Kingdom or Europe, is he? It's just in the Muslim world. Is that right?
Yeah, as he expressed on the show, it was for the Muslim world because it's an obligation for Muslims to be united. The Quran says, "Do not be divided amongst yourselves." And so, as Muslims, we have to not be divided. And divided can only mean not that we all agree with each other on every single point. That's impossible. Not even the Sahabas, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, agreed with everything with each other. They had all agreements, but they were politically united. It was of utmost importance, to the point that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhum launched a war to stop people from splitting away, because the obligation was so important. As the Quran says, not for our strength, not to depart, by us, our bickering and our infighting. So we have to be united so that we can call to Tawheed, call to the oneness of God, a comprehensive tawhid in all aspects of human affairs, and make God's word the highest. So this is what is the standard orthodox Islamic thinking behind the issue of Khilafah. The issue of Khilafah is not a monopoly of Hizb ut-Tahrir. It is standard orthodoxy in classical thinking in actually every school of thought that is today.
Piers Morgan shows, you say the ticker tape at the bottom, even before he said a single word, had already labeled him an extremist. So in other words, he set up the audience to go boo, boo, even before they've heard the man speak, So it's a terrible way of treating people. But the point you make is that the thing that the doctor is calling for is actually normative Islam. It's mainstream Islam. It's the Islam represented by all schools of thought, all sects, all groups in Islamic history. So it's not exactly extremist. It's just normative Islam, isn't it? Is that right?
Yes. As I said, open up any classical scholar's book for 1,300 years from any school of thought you'd care to mention and think of. And they all say exactly the same thing. It is an obligation for Muslims to be under in lands that Muslims control the sovereignty over. So we control the rule over it, or i.e. a Muslim majority land or what have you. That the highest law of the land is the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So his word is the highest. And that there can be no divisions between Muslim lands.
Right. It's not calling for not calling for the caliphate in England. He's not calling for Sharia law either. I say that because that was one of the questions that he was asked. Do you think Piers was unfair to Dr. Wahid compared to his non-Muslim guests?
Oh, very much so. I mean, the asking the leading question, and you mentioned that. It's good you mentioned that, which is he asked him, "Do you want to see Sharia in England?" Right. And now this is one of those questions where it's vague enough such that if you say if a person was to respond yes because they think that Sharia is the best law for mankind, it gives rights, it understands human nature, so it gives the appropriate solution. So he wants all human beings to open up the Quran, embrace it voluntarily, and want to establish this law. So you could say that the person who believes that Sharia law is the law of the creator of the universe for mankind would want to see that, as in they desire it. But if you were to say yes to that, this right-wing platform would make it look to its audience that Muslims are actively trying to transform the law of the UK into Islamic law, just simply because they say, wouldn't you want this?
Right. And the word Sharia itself has a certain dog whistle quality in the Western media, in Western civilization. So it has certain connotations of hand chopping or stoning and so on, which is a very unfair representation of Sharia, which is much more to do with, in terms of the legal Sharia, the Islamic law, to do with, inheritance and prayer and how you worship and other sort of commercial business. It's only the tiniest slither of the legal system is concerned with the hudud punishments, and even then those punishments are really misunderstood in the West as well. But that's a whole different subject. But Piers putting it that way is a way of kind of arguably triggering that response in his audience. You have no real understanding of what the subject is about, so they are going to respond in a uninformed reactionary way, which is exactly what Piers would like, of course, to discredit his guest. Would you agree with that?
Well, indeed. I mean, I consider it to be one of those questions that has two horns in it, right? So you're either mauled by one horn or you're mauled by the other horn. So if you say yes, the audience will be made to think that the guest wants to establish Islamic law by force and force on every non-Muslim and subjugate them. And if they say no, then it makes it obviously it makes the Muslim look out to be that they feel that their own law system is not the best system in the world. It's substandard, and they have to protect people from it. So don't come near me. Don't catch the cold. Don't catch COVID from me, or something like this, right? I don't know. We don't want you to. I don't want to see anyone else benefit from Sharia law. So it's the way it's formulated as a yes or no question. Destroys the context. Whereas the Islamic understanding of it is that Sharia law is not even, or Sharia, because Sharia just means law. There's a famous
tautology, isn't it?
Yeah. There's a Jewish text in Arabic that was written in Egypt where it describes it. It talks about Sharia Yahudiya, right? So Jewish law, right? But it uses the word Sharia because it's just an Arabic word that can be applied to mean law. So the Islamic understanding is that even in under a caliphate system in the Middle East for centuries and centuries, Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians were not under Islamic law. They were pig farms that was noted by a Muslim traveler in 10th century Iraq who was passing by, saw a Christian, like, what pig farm? So, yeah, that's a Christian town. Ah, okay, right. And then, you know,
and they can drink alcohol. Christians can drink alcohol, even though it's prohibited for Muslims. But this is in this under Muslim rule and the Ottoman Empire, and the millet. It's called the millet system, which is very well known, well documented. It went on for centuries. So Christians and Jews and others had their rights. They could live according to their own light, their own laws. They weren't forced to obey Sharia law. It's not. Is it not? Perhaps not accurate to say that there was zero. Obviously, if you committed murder, say you were, you were. If a Christian killed a Christian, presumably then they were tried under Islamic law, were they, or not?
Well, it was more. It was more basically a case of anyone who walks into an Islamic court will be judged by an Islamic court. But if you choose not to go into an Islamic court, no one's going to force you to come in if you are non-Muslim. Okay. So we know this because there is documentation of Egyptian in Islamic Egypt. I think maybe 9th century or so, where some Christians, some Jews went into Islamic courts to seek settlements for divorce and what have you, because they felt that it gave them a better settlement than their own courts. But no one compelled them to come in. So no one's going to close the door to non-Muslims who want to go into Islamic court. However, if a killing happens, Christian versus Christian, Jew versus Jew, in their own community, that's for their own community to sort out. In many cases, each communities had their own police, for example. So they had their own police, they had their own law courts, and their law courts.
Autonomy then within the wider empire. They had autonomy from the Sharia law. And again, this is not something that's appreciated in the West, outside of academic circles and Muslim circles, obviously, but in the wider public. And Piers Morgan showed no understanding of that, let alone any nuance in the few things he might have understood. But do you think that he demonstrated specifically Islamophobic sentiments towards Islam and Muslims?
Well, I mean that's I suppose a point of dispute. But I wanted to just bring in something very quickly. What you said previously, which is a little term I introduced, which is you could say confessional federalism, right? That an Islamic system, a caliphate system, the Millah system, was actually about. It wasn't based on territory, so like this territory, that territory is federalized. Although there are territories where you might say this is an autonomous zone for Jews or Christians, but by zone there was no walls or borders, right? Anyone could freely go in and out. There's no what have you, but they just acknowledged that
no visas needed, no passports needed,
no checkpoints or all that kind of stuff.
I've got a friend of mine who went from Egypt to Saudi Arabia for Hajj, and he needed a visa. It's all part of the Islamic world, but that wouldn't have happened under when the Islam was generally practiced throughout the Islamic world. There was free movement of peoples.
Yeah, there was no divisions, as the Quran warns us not to have. But today we have these divisions, which are called borders. But the point being is that Islam came not to force non-Muslims to embrace Islam or be under Islamic law. Islamic law only can benefit Muslims. It can't increase the righteousness of someone who rejects or disbelieves in Islam. So what's the point, right? What's the point of making a Christian not drink alcohol because it's prohibited for Muslims? It's not going to increase their righteousness because they first must believe in the latest prophet, the final prophet, in order to kind of attain righteousness. Because as we know, you can't reject any prophet that the Creator sends to mankind, even if it's but I'm following an old version, the old, of was it Mac OS or whatever. I don't need this later version. It's not like that, right? It's not like, I'm happy with an older version. No, you have to. If the Creator sends a new prophet, you must follow a new prophet. So there's no point anyway in forcing people who don't want to believe in Islam to practice it, in essence. So that's why Islamic law is not even applied on non-Muslims within an Islamic system. All that is applied, all that is held to, and this is a question your audience might ask, is that if a let's say a Muslim interacts with a Christian negatively, kills them, or a Christian kills a Muslim, or so on, this will be dealt with according to the terms of an agreement called the dhimma, which is in essence a social contract, as Rousseau would say, which would stipulate and regulate the interactions between communities, and it is negotiated upon the time of their incorporation into an Islamic system, and then it'll be held as a standard and rights that will guarantee their rights and guarantee the rights of Muslims in their interaction, but allowing them at the same time, very importantly, their autonomy. And it's not just their autonomy to have divorces or marriages, which in some Western countries there is some degree of latitude to religious rules on this. No, their criminal law system, if whatever Christians might interpret a criminal or penal system to be, that they can apply that, and the Jewish law and its penal system can be applied within the Jewish community between Jews who believe in that system. So it's a full powers to their courts, not just a reduced power. Anyway, I just thought I might make that clear.
It's also struck me what you described there as very pluralist. I mean, pluralist in a very real fundamental sense. So rather than kind of pluralism we have in the West, which is basically within a one size fits all legal system. In other words, there's no pluralism. Here you have a jurisprudential pluralism, actually, which recognizes the confessional legal systems of different communities, and that is something the West really can't handle and doesn't want and won't allow. I mean, it's actually prohibited. Think how strongly that belief in one system for everyone is held by Britain and America. But in Islam, that there's this plurality at a fundamental level.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, Islam doesn't have plurality for its own sake, as in just to check the box. Hey, look, we're pluralistic. It's just recognizing the salvific reality as well as the human reality that, firstly, there's no point forcing Islam onto non-Muslims, because forcing them to practice Islam when they don't believe it's not going to save anybody in the hereafter, for those who are insincere and want to reject truth. And secondly is, people, if they don't believe in a system, how can you expect them to follow it? Right? The only thing they can follow, the only thing that's left, is they must stick to their agreements, which is why Islam's kind of relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims is governed by agreement that's negotiated between the communities, and that forms the basis of the interaction. So, okay, you have a different law system, I have a different law system. We might not agree on all the particulars, but we're going to let's negotiate as to, when we have interactions between us, how are we going to resolve any problems or issues or tensions. And when you're left to your business, when it's within your community, I'm left to my business within my community. But when we interact, we have this mutually agreed document that can govern our relations and ensure kind of harmonious coexistence. So this is, I think, the more enlightened Islamic approach to it. But anyway, sorry, you asked me a question, so I'll go back to that one.
Piers Morgan demonstrated Islamophobic sentiments during the interview that you saw.
Well, certainly, the question is, so I think what happened, just to remind the audience, was, Dr. Abdul was speaking to Piers Morgan, and Piers Morgan was brought up. I think the discussion about women's rights came up, and so Dr. Abdul asked Piers Morgan, like, why do you think so many women are embracing Islam more than men? And in that discussion, Piers Morgan kind of responded with a question, right? It's like, is it because they want to be oppressed, according to you, or something like this? So he kind of tried to get a caveat there. But at one point he did say, right, when I think Dr. Abdul talked about Sharia and what Sharia can give women in terms of rights, Piers Morgan said, I won't remember exactly, but he said along the lines of, I know very well what Sharia does to women, or what it gives to women, implying it's not a positive way, right? And this is viewed as by some to be a Freudian slip as to Piers Morgan's perhaps perceptions of Islam. And then he went to go and obviously discuss. At a later show with Dili Hussein, he brought up the example of the Taliban and how women are treated under the Taliban, and so on. Now, Also, people have asked questions regarding when Piers Morgan has engaged Dr. Abdul Wahid on the issue of homosexuality and homosexuals and LGBTQ. And people have juxtaposed that with his interview with Ben Shapiro, who's a practicing Jew, and he believes in Jewish law. And he rejects, obviously, gay marriage and or non-traditional marriage, or whatever, how it's defined. He said that his religion doesn't obviously accept this, and his religion has a certain understanding or model for a family. But of course, Ben Shapiro's religion, like Islam, believe that the practice of same-sex relations outside of marriage, or even opposite-sex relations outside of marriage, is forbidden. It's a sin.
Yeah, any sexual activity outside of marriage. But
so people raise questions like, why is Piers approaching Ben Shapiro with not even challenging him and not saying that oh, do you think homosexuality is a sin? Didn't ask him that question. Okay. But as far as I can recall, but that question was asked of Dr. Abdul Wahid. So why this different treatment between a Muslim and a non-Muslim guest? And in this particular case, a guest, he was Jewish, and I mention that because Judaism and Islam have an immense amount of similarities.
Indeed,
like Christianity.
Yeah, Islam and Christianity are much more similar than, say, Judaism and Christianity. And that's the irony. People in the West talk about Judeo-Christian values. They're very similar, but actually the similarities with Islam and Judaism, and Christianity is the outlier, the one that's very, very different from either of those two religions. Very ironic, really. So on the next of those 4 shows, the Piers Morgan Uncensored show on Talk TV, just in the last 7 days, well, a few days ago, actually, on the 12th of December. It's like on the 12th day of Christmas. The 12th day, oh, sorry, that's a
open the Advent calendar, the Piers Morgan Advent calendar.
Yeah. Time you open that Advent calendar, we find a panel discussion called Fit to Practice, the Fallout. This is after the Dr. Abdullah video interview, rather, of course. And this was that discussion that you had yourself with a Canadian-Palestinian medical doctor who was born in Gaza, along with the famous or infamous Douglas Murray. And I understand that Douglas Murray made the comment that the number of dead, a huge, unprecedented number of dead reported in Gaza, this statistic comes from Hamas, and therefore should be discarded for some reason. Is there good cause to doubt the numbers, do you think? Was Douglas Murray right to cast doubt simply because it was Hamas?
Sure. So yeah, this was the second show of this kind of week's marathon of Palestinian and Israeli discussions and narratives and appearing on the show. And the show was it was titled "Fit to Practice," meaning is Abdul Wahid was referring to the show that happened the day before. Is he fit to practice? Practice being a doctor, and then it said the fallout. So this show was very ad hoc. And I was only contacted to go on this show about just only a few hours before.
Really? Oh my goodness!
Go on air.
That's that call. Would you come on live national television in a couple of hours?
Yeah, like how quick can you get it, basically? Yeah. And so I had to rush, and it was one of those cases where there's no time to prep. There's no time for, but. What was at stake, of course, was quite important because I had seen that program the day before, and I felt that how Dr. Abdul Wahid was treated was not like how other guests were treated. There were things that were used against Dr. Abdul Wahid, which I think was rather unreasonable, trying to kind of attack him for what it was at a protest, at a demonstration for Gaza. And this is what the show was based on, was that at this demonstration for Gaza, Abdul Wahid was there, and there was like these 2 people on the side of that demonstration, and they were shouting, "Jihad, Jihad." And so this was used against Abdul Wahid, saying, your group, Hizb ut-Tahrir and so on, at this demonstration, your members were shouting, Jihad. Well, it's not his members. I mean, like, people just turn up to a demonstration. It's only the members of that group. There was all kinds of people turning up. So so that fallout, I'm not sure the exact fallout that was being discussed, but it did appear on some newspapers, online newspapers afterwards, after that the show aired. Obviously, attacking Dr. Abdul Wahid, although he was already in the news before that, which is what led to Piers Morgan's show about him. So they didn't kind of start an expose on him. It was already done and those issues were already raised. But Piers Morgan wanted to interrogate Dr. Abdul Wahid rather than interview him, I feel. So anyway, so then this is the fallout. So I come in to discuss the fallout, the topics.
Just pause you there. I'm just very curious to know. Did you get a telephone call from someone? Did you get a telephone call from the production team or a producer or something from Sky News? How did it happen? And did they send like a chauffeur-driven car, or did they expect you to get the bus to the studio? Or I mean, how does it actually work? You get a phone call. Hello, we're from Sky News or whatever. We want you on your show in 2 hours. I mean, is that what they said?
Well, it's not like it almost evokes the like the possibility like Mission Impossible, where the agent gets his contact, good evening, agent, whatever, you have a mission.
Get to
and this message will self-destruct in 30 seconds and that kind of stuff. Well, basically, so I had already been on that show before, the Piers Morgan show, last year. It was on the it was after the attack against Salman Rushdie,
right,
which occurred, and they got me on, and they also got Douglas Murray on again because of apparently.
Was that the first time you met him, Douglas Murray?
No, I actually encountered him in the flesh many years ago on a BBC program called The Big Questions.
Oh yes, I remember that.
Part of a panel discussion.
You've got a bit of history, a bit of form with him, haven't you? Then you know each other from several TV appearances.
Yes, you could say that. Unfortunately, we never really had a proper debate, because what usually happens is, so I express some of my arguments and points, and then he comments on what I say, and then I am prevented from responding to him. Right, generally speaking. So I'm rather kind of limited or prevented in many cases from having a proper response to him, whereas his response to me is usually uninterrupted, and they give him plenty of speaking time to say as much as he wants, usually involving ad hominems against myself. He quite likes that.
So he has the advantage. He's given the advantage over you deliberately then.
Now, initially, when I heard he was coming on, I was thinking, well, it might be worth it to engage him on one point that I really wanted to engage him on, was something he said during an interview recently, where he equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And he said that Muslims don't love Palestinians. This is what he said. Muslims don't love other Muslims. Right? The only reason that Muslims are protesting and demonstrating against what's happening in Gaza is because they hate Jews. That's what he was basically arguing, which is completely ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. And his argument was, his argument was that the reason why his argument, evidence he proffered for this was that the different Muslim rulers, because they don't seem to come to the aid of the Gazans, it demonstrates that Muslims don't care about other Muslims. And that was his evidence, right?
Serious? That's such an incredibly stupid argument when you know basic facts about the world and the asymmetry of power, etc., etc.
And so, and he said it was that the reason that Muslims were demonstrating against Zionism was because they hate Jews, and he used the term because they have an ancient hatred.
Right.
That was the term he used. And I wanted to, when I heard I'm actually going to share a platform with him, that was actually going to be, I said, you know what, I'm going to do this so I can respond to this, because this is ridiculous and very dangerous to the rights of people who are demonstrating for Gazans and Palestinians.
Yeah, because it takes away the legitimacy completely. If they're just doing it because they hate people, that's not that's not noble. You can close a march down like that easily. Hey, it's just hate march, as the Home Secretary at the time said, actually.
You could even argue, if they get their way, that the slightest support for the Palestinians is racism. They'll say because it's anti-Jewish or anti-Semite, as anti-Semitic. This is the danger of allowing that narrative to go unchecked. And I was gonna go on the program. Initially, my reason for agreeing to go on the program was I thought that he might be in the studio, and I could engage him and just simply ask this question that, you said is an ancient hatred. I think you need to look in the mirror. Which civilization was the one who believed that the Jews killed Jesus, the savior of mankind, quote unquote, right? It's not us, right? We don't believe that. Which civilization coined the blood libel, the idea that Jews kill the babies of Gentiles and mix it into their mats of bread or something like this? I forgot what it was. As part of their rituals. It's not from the Muslim world.
No.
Yeah.
It's a Christian virus that basically, that when it was secularized, was taken up by the National Socialists, of course, in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, who believed in the superiority of the Germanic race or Germanic races, right? And the inferiority of the Semitic races, which, as we know, in the 19th century, this idea of the superiority of the Germanic races was juxtaposed with the inferiority of races such as Black people from sub-Saharan Africa and other places, and Semites, which included Arabs.
Exactly.
In that, because Semites were part of that, and Phoenicians, which is an older term for people from Lebanon and Syria, and so on and so forth. So this is where the term anti-Semitic comes from, which is the people citing the superiority of the Germanic race over the Semites, who are meant to be the inferior race. And if you, I mean, Douglas Murray, he talks about, as you probably are aware from the many years of where we've all been hearing his what some might argue is hate speech. He's been talking about the superiority of Western civilization, its moral and ethical superiority. It's being taken over by a minority that has different practices, different values, different culture, and it's a threat to Western civilization, and we have to deal with it. And he also famously said that conditions for Muslims must be made harder across the board to make England a less attractive place to immigrate to, and so on and so forth. Now, if you take out the word or phrase Western civilization and replace it with Germanic people, and you take out the word Muslim from his books and you replace it with a Jew or Jews, it would not be out of place in the rhetoric of the British Union of Fascists under Oswald Mosley 100 years ago in England, and as well as fascists and other anti-Semites throughout Europe 100 years ago, because we've heard this rhetoric before. Maybe the terms have slightly changed a little bit. We don't call Western civilization the Germanic peoples anymore, or Germanic race. We call it just Western civilization now. But I was going to raise these issues, that the ancient hatred doesn't come from Muslims who have the same theology as Jews and Judaism, concerning we believe in one God, we don't believe in Trinity, we don't believe in incarnation of God in the human
we
flesh.
believe in divine law as well. Something the Christians, of course, have abandoned in favor of a secular order, which is completely unresponsive to divine commands. So they completely abandoned the religion of Jesus and the religion of Moses, arguably. So.
Yeah,
but
I was going to mention also that the meat that has been butchered according to kashrut or kosher laws, which is Jewish, under Jewish law, is clean for us. We can't actually have other meat. I know there's difference of opinion. Someone might say Christians also included. Christian butchered meat is also included as clean, but there's a consensus in that meat that has been ritually slaughtered through passed by the hands of Jews is clean for Muslims to eat. It's clean meat for us.
Well, it's not an enlightened opinion of Muslims. It's in the Quran. So you're allowed to eat the food of the people of the book, but
and marry them, as well.
And you can marry their women as well.
Yeah.
If you should wish to. But just to come back to the comment made by Douglas Murray, that the number of dead reported in Gaza, which is obviously rapidly increasing, and unprecedented number of deaths since the Second World War, I think, is these figures are coming from the Hamas Health Authority, literally, and should therefore be discarded. Is there any good reason, do you think, to doubt these numbers?
Yeah. So basically, So in the show, as we mentioned, the amount of dead that happened that occurred in Gaza, because this was primarily the main the show, although it was about Abdul Wahid in theory, and he was mentioned now and again. It became about Gaza because we wanted to bring it right back to the issue of Gaza, because that was the key point. As we mentioned, the amount of dead that the Palestinians have suffered, and so. Douglas Murray, I mean, like at a point, Piers Morgan, when faced with our questions and our interrogation of him, decided to phone a friend, as they say, in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and get Douglas Murray in, who was allowed uninterrupted speaking time, at least he wasn't interrupted by Piers Morgan. And he started off the bat by disputing the numbers of dead that have been reported by the health ministry, the Gazan health ministry, by saying that because they are ministry under the Hamas government, that you should doubt the numbers. It's just propaganda. It's just been blown out of proportion, and so on and so forth. The problem with this is that, okay, I know that we should always check, and we need to verify, and if there's cause to doubt, then of course we should always be skeptical where necessary. But this completely ignores the fact that because it's not the first war that's been happening. Well, calling it a war is actually almost
it's a genocide, but
it's a genocide. A war implies they're on equal footing. They're not. So in previous I call them suppressions of Gaza by Israel, probably the better word for it, where over 1,000 Gazans have died. In every single time in the past where the casualties have been reported by the Gazan health ministry, later on, Israel has basically come up with roughly the same figures, right? So
and figures have been accepted, I understand, by the United Nations and other independent agencies, the Hamas Health Authority, repeatedly. The journalists like The Guardian have commented that there's never been any reason to doubt these figures. Actually, in the past, they've always been reliable. So unless Douglas Murray's got some fantastic new insight, it sounds like he's just been prejudiced against Hamas because he doesn't like Hamas.
Well, he wants to downplay the casualties that the Gazans have faced because it draws attention, and this is what I believe is because it draws attention, unwanted attention, to the sheer atrocity that Israel is committing against the Palestinians in Gaza, and so he wants to downplay, even though, just like all the previous suppressions of Gaza in the past, the figures that the Israeli government will recognize eventually is pretty much the same as the health authority, and they're not just figures that are reported, but they actually are given with IDs, right, and with Israeli government IDs, because Israeli government has IDs for every Palestinian in the occupied territories. So they're not just submitted with like here's a number, believe us. It's here's the names, and here's are the IDs, the Israeli IDs that go with these names. So it's been authenticated by UNRWA, United Nations, a body there, and that's what the doctor that came on with me, Dr. Izzadeen Abuleish, said as well. This is what he responded to Douglas Murray, but Douglas Murray said, no, it's just a Hamas propaganda and what have you, and so how can we ever believe it? So he came on. That was his kind of opening salvo. Pretty much, and then he mostly went into attack, obviously initially Abdul Wahid, and when I started to then raise issue with Douglas by in essence arguing that what he's saying was factually incorrect, and his one issue was this. So he was advocating for Hizb ut-Tahrir to be banned. It's not a violent group. It doesn't call to terrorism. It doesn't advocate terrorism.
Because if it had been a violent group, if it had advocated terrorism, it would have been banned anyway by now under existing legislation. It wouldn't have been unbanned. You don't need to call for it to be banned if it was doing those kinds of things anyway, because they'd be illegal anyway. And the
Yeah.
fact is, the Hizb ut-Tahrir have never ever, well, I'm sure you know better than I, but never ever called for violent action or anything at all. So it's a paradox. If they were calling from that, why aren't they banned anyway? Because they're just ordinary law would deal with that. Anyone who calls for violence is going to be prosecuted or dealt with, I would argue.
Yes, but the British government has for many years, certainly the Conservative government has for many years, always been reviewing the possibility of banning it, but always been prevented from doing so, because if it does attempt to ban Hizb ut-Tahrir and Hizb ut-Tahrir challenge them in court and they lose, then that shuts the door forever. Because also, as you know, every court case in English common law is legislation. So if the case it becomes official that any group like that cannot be banned. And so the British government like to keep things nice and vague on certain applications of legislation, unless they absolutely necessarily have to go in there and say, all right, we when they feel that there's a good strong case to ban and prosecute. So this is why Hizb ut-Tahrir has not been banned in the UK, even though the Conservative government has very much expressed its desire to do so for many years, over 10 years now, in fact.
But it has been banned in other countries, in Europe even. I think in Germany, I think it's banned, and maybe in other countries as well. So it's not like it's not banned in the West. It is banned in the West, isn't it? In some other countries.
Well, here's actually where I challenged Douglas Murray on this. So he was saying it was banned. It's banned in Saudi. It's banned in Egypt and so on. He was rolling off a list of countries, and I was initially wanted to say, you know, these these countries you're listing off, these renowned bastions of free speech that we should emulate, right? Is that what you're arguing for? That we should emulate the types of laws in ironically in the Muslim world? You want to bring that into the UK? That was a great irony in that I don't think Douglas Murray fully appreciated. But I challenged him on one thing, which is that he argued that it was actually banned in Germany. And I challenged him on this because it isn't. And I said this. I said that it's. I said, like, you know, give me one country. He said he was banned in Europe. So I said, where in Europe? Because he was making it sound like it was all of Europe. And he said, oh, well, in Germany, it's banned in Germany. And I said, it's actually not banned in Germany as an organization. And I was very careful to add as an organization, as opposed to it's banned, its activities are banned, which is true. Its activities are banned. But as an organization, its membership isn't banned. You can be openly and profess openly that you are a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Germany. You can organize events as long as it's not under the Hizb ut-Tahrir name, calling to the exact same things that Hizb ut-Tahrir calls to, as a known member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, and that's legal in Germany.
Right. It sounds a rather odd thing to ban in that particular way, because you can easily get around it by obviously how you can get around it. Yeah.
Well, as it what's banned is the activities, and so I said to people to Google it, and because I think the Hizb ut-Tahrir website, as I believe, explains the nature of this, because they famously challenged this in the European Court of Human Rights. They argued that it was unfair to ban an organization that is peaceful and doesn't call to violence. The German government banned it under the argument that since Hizb ut-Tahrir calls for the political destruction of Israel, or dismantlement of Israel as an ethno state, in essence, which is not the same as calling to individuals to be killed or destroyed, but rather, because a state is actually a non-physical thing, right? A state just exists in our minds. Actually, political systems and borders actually just exist in our minds. Only when we build a fence, then we give some physicality to it, but it's not really a physical thing that can be killed per se. So they argued that because Hizb ut-Tahrir is calling for the political destruction of the state of Israel, that they were a racist and anti-Semitic organization, and because Germany has a certain past, which we all might know of, which is quite prominent, concerning its treatment of Jews, it's very sensitive when it comes to anything that pertains to Judaism or Jewish community. Even though, and we should always make the argument that Israel and Zionism is not the same as Judaism. right? And is not the same, does not speak for the Jewish people, even if the state of Israel would like to think it does, and it does attempt to do so, arguing that war reparations that Germany must pay for the Jews that they killed must be paid to Israel, who would then distribute it out accordingly. So Israel is not the inheritor of Jews. It should be anyone who's a family member or maybe an independent charity can collect that money and give it to people like Jewish people in need or what have you. But the state of Israel doesn't represent the Jewish people around the world. And as you know, there are many Jews who, significant proportions of Jews around the world, oppose Zionism and what the state of Israel is doing. And Zionism is the idea that, of all the Semitic groups and peoples that live in the land of Palestine, the state should only represent one of them, predominantly via a majority group. Anyway, I digress. So I pointed out to Douglas Murray that Hizb ut-Tahrir, its activities are banned in essence. Although I didn't get enough time to explain that level of detail, but I said it's not banned, and I said it quite explicitly as an organization. It's banned. Its activities are banned. Yes, and the reason why I say this, and it's not pedantic, is because in England, we have the terror laws allow for the proscription of groups, so for them to be banned. If a group is banned in the UK, it means that it is illegal to be a member of that group. You cannot be a member or profess membership or invite a membership to a group. Very important. And Douglas Murray wanted to bring a ban against Hizb ut-Tahrir in the UK. So when he said that, look, it's not a strange thing. In essence, he said it's not a strange thing for such bans to occur for non-violent groups because it already exists in a liberal democracy like ourselves, Germany. I wanted to challenge him on that, saying no, it's not the case in Germany. It's the activities are banned, but you can be a member. You can profess that you're a member as long as you don't do activities under the name of that group. So there's a clear difference.
Okay. Now, Douglas Murray was also very critical, I think, of the notion that jihad was being proclaimed or mentioned on the streets of London. And in that respect, actually, many people would have been alarmed. I mean, publicly, in the public, I mean, because of what they understand by the word jihad and the kind of trigger that has been instilled in many people thanks to the media. But in your opinion, what was his argument trying to achieve?
Well, it was, again, referring to Dr. Abdul Wahid's kind of speaking at a demonstration that was organized by Hizb ut-Tahrir in London. And what Hizb ut-Tahrir was calling to was that the armies of the Muslim world, so the state armies, the official soldiers and military of states of these Muslim countries should come and rescue the Gazans. They should come and rescue the Gazans and intervene militarily. So as they said this, two people next to them in this camera footage, presumably by perhaps I think Sky or Daily Mail, I forget which it was by a right-wing media group that filmed this, panned towards these two guys shouting, "Jihad, jihad, jihad," right, nearby. And these people actually were conspicuously not actually part of the main group. But regardless of that, because when Abdul Wahid was asked by Piers Morgan, do you condemn that people are calling to jihad or are using the word? And even Abdul Wahid said, well, no, I'm not going to condemn the concept of jihad. And then it was upon this that the next day on the show with us, Douglas Murray came and said he expressed umbrage at the fact that the word jihad can be mentioned on the streets of London. Like, don't mention the word. And the way he framed it was as if you were calling for war on the streets of London, basically.
Yes.
Fighting.
Absolutely, no, that's what he meant. Yeah. Which of course is wrong because that's not what was meant. Yeah,
it's mischaracterizing. It's deliberately misleading, and that's the problem with Douglas Murray, is that he uses statements which are misleading and mischaracterizing. And so Abdul Wahid said, I'm not going to apologize for this. And I would argue, I kind of wanted to make the point, and here's a problem with my engagement with Douglas Murray and right-wing media, which is the right-wing media, they're very protective of Douglas. they don't like to expose him to the potential of actually being refuted. And Douglas Murray has never accepted or to do a one-on-one debate with someone like myself. No,
Right. Yeah,
no.
interesting.
Now he would presumably, and he said that he actually attacked me personally during the show, saying, "This person is kind of an inconsequential person." And then he said, "Yeah, I see him on different. He's on different TV programs and platforms." And I was like, "Well, it's a bit." I was thinking to myself, it's a bit strange for an inconsequential person to be on all these different media platforms, because by definition, if you're on a multiple media platforms, you're having some consequence. I mean, maybe not major, but at least some consequence. And considering that Douglas Murray was very happy back in the day, many years ago, to debate the infamous Anjem Chowdhury at a public venue, if you remember that.
Gosh, I forgot about that. Yeah, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, he wanted to have a big public debate with Anjem Chowdhury, who, Muslims in the UK, we used to kind of cringe at, because his group Al Mahajroon, who are banned, right? They kind of advocated for terrorism, basically. But we cringe at Anjem Chowdhury even before his group was banned. He was still very disliked amongst many Muslims, because his group would say things which were almost calculated to anger and rile up wider society. Things like, if you shake the hand of a non-Muslim, you must use your left hand, the hand you use to clean yourself with, for example.
You say that?
I was like, yes. I mean, this is from his group, Andrew Chowdhury's group, Al Mahajroon, and I have never heard in all my multiple decades of being a Muslim, I've never heard of a single narration or a single verse of Quran that ever advocated that. They were just making things up just to be inflammatory against one society. So Douglas Murray was perfectly happy to want to debate that guy, right? But he doesn't want to debate someone like me, who might not give him exactly what he wants from such encounters. So he mentioned jihad, and I was thinking to my head, and I had written down to respond. I was like, okay, like Douglas Murray, jihad simply means just war in its legal context, in legal meaning of it in Islamic literature. It's a just war. It could be a war against oppression. It could be war to rescue those who are being oppressed. It can be fighting against empires and their hold over different nations and peoples and so on. Like, for example, the war against the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire wasn't indigenous to Syria or Egypt. What was it doing there? It was basically having a stranglehold on the peoples there. So jihad is a just warfare, and the particular context that his particular demonstration was discussing the rescue of the Gazans by the Muslim militaries of a people who are being oppressed.
If we had called for not use the word jihad, but meant the same thing when it comes to Ukraine and the Russians, that would have been not only applauded, but actually is government policy, the West's policy, who are sending tanks and planes and whatever, even troops on the ground, not necessarily fighting Russians, but there as advisors. So there's no problem there, is it, in supporting militarily a group that is being occupied by a foreign power, and that we have endless sympathy and support for. But it's an analogous situation in Gaza is completely the reverse. Anyway, it's the fact that it's happening so almost at the same time. It is happening at the same time because the situation in Ukraine is ongoing. These two conflicts are ongoing at the same time, but the West's response to them is completely diametrically opposite.
Actually, why are you being anti-Slavic for? Like, Ukraine is Slavic land, and the Russians are Slavs, right? And there are Russians that live in Ukraine. So you attacking the right of Russia to defend its fellow Russians on Slavic land, which is ancestral Slavic land. It just seems that's anti-Slavic to me. I'm concerned of your anti-Slavicness.
Well, I think deeply about my troubling attitudes. Thank you for that.
Yes,
I just want to ask something else that Piers Morgan asked Dr. Abdullah here, suggested rather that he supported Hamas during the interview. Is there any foundation to this allegation, do you think? Do you think he does support Hamas?
Well, actually, there was one more quick point. So on the previous question, before it disappears from my head, was I wanted to point out the hypocrisy of Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray is infamous for being a neoconservative, and for anyone who knows what neoconservative means, they're the ones who are described as usually the war hawks. They advocate for wars around the world to spread,
Iraq, Afghanistan,
yeah,
etc.
a secular liberal democracy, using bombs, tanks, guns, bullets. So they're the ones that are actually believe in warfare. And yet Douglas Murray is attacking Abdullah. So how dare you call to warfare in defense of the oppressed? The only people who should have a monopoly on war is people like to initiate it or call for it is people like myself, us fellow neoconservatives. So I wanted to mention that the
That's a good point.
hypocrisy.
That's a good point. Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, so get back to your question. So
yeah, he's accused of supporting Hamas, Dr. Abdul Wahid, during the interview. Is there any foundation, do you think, to that allegation?
Okay, so yeah, Piers Morgan accused Abdul Wahid of basically supporting terrorism and supporting Hamas by saying that he expressed that Hamas was a resistance group and not a terror group. So initially, when I was looking at the interview with Piers and Abdul Wahid was asked a question about about Palestinians and about the operations that are launched by Palestinians, and so he argued that in general there is a right that Palestinians possess, which is called the right of resistance against an occupation power. Certainly, it is understood that in West Bank and in Gaza, these two particular places are understood internationally as occupied territories. And so there is a legal question, I suppose, between international lawyers as to, if there's there might not be a state, although the state of Palestine actually is recognized as a state by many countries around the world. Actually, the majority of countries around the world recognize the so-called state of Palestine. But the question is now, do the Palestinians in the occupied territories have the right of resistance against an occupying power? So Abdul Wahid was arguing that they do. And I suppose implicit in this is that Hamas, as a subset of Palestinians, are under the same umbrella as the Palestinians in that sense, in terms of they have the same right as their fellow Palestinians in occupied territory to resist. That was his argument.
Right.
So this was used by Piers Morgan to argue that. So then you're supporting Hamas, and Hamas is a proscribed organization in the UK, so it's illegal to support Hamas in the UK or express support for Hamas. And that's a general term, by the way, because what do you mean by that exactly? Because one could say that, for example, the Basque, ETA, the Basque kind of liberation organization or resistance organization or what have you, whatever term it was, I've got the exact title it went by. ETA, they are resisting kind of the control of Madrid, control of of Spain. They want to be separate, they want to have independence, so they would describe themselves as a resistance group. But they used terrorist methods, which are, they did kill Spanish civilians, non-Basque civilians.
Yeah.
And there's no defense for that. There's no justification for that. It doesn't mean now that just because they'll be called a resistance group, that justifies them or supports them. It's just a description of the fight that they are doing, which is they are resisting control by a bigger power. It doesn't mean that it's not a moral prescription. It's just a description of them, of their context, I suppose, and the nature of their fight that they are resisting. They can still be criminal in their actions. They can still be immoral in their actions. It doesn't. Yeah. So in terms of that, Dr. Abdul Wahid didn't express that he agreed with he supports Hamas killing civilians. He supports Hamas, or that he supports Hamas itself. By the way, he's just merely stated that they're a resistance group because they are a subset of Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank, although they mostly located in Gaza.
I've heard commentators in the West say, obviously Hamas are terrible people, and ordinary Gazans wouldn't support them, and they've not had an election, God knows how many years. But actually, a very reliable opinion poll was done a few days ago and said that there's a huge increase in support for Hamas, and also support for them in the West Bank, where Hamas doesn't exist. They are becoming very popular now, or the support is much more increasing for them, presumably because they are seen as the defenders of the invaders who are genociding their people. Tens of thousands of women and children have been killed, and at that point, Hamas become much more popular, I would imagine, because they're the only armed resistance, or one of the main armed resistance around, protecting the population against the aggressors who are invading their territory. So that's an interesting, not irony, but it's an interesting kind of shift in sentiments there amongst the Palestinians.
Yeah, but the issue is in the UK context, and here's what some people were accusing Piers Morgan of doing, was like, why are you asking your guest questions which are potentially could potentially land them in jail, could potentially be illegal, and for non UK watchers of your platform, as I said, the terrorism laws in the UK are very stringent, and even the definition of terrorism is very stringent. In essence, any violence for a political cause, or a political, racial, religious cause, but any violence done in support of that cause is terrorism, and it's as broad as that. It doesn't mention civilians or non-combatants.
But what if I support violence against the Russians and their occupation of Ukraine? I support the Ukrainian resistance.
In theory, under the law, that's illegal. That's
it's not illegal,
advocating terrorism.
The British government would be in the dock.
Yes. So we have to go by case law, and there was a case where, I think it was in 2006, an individual that was supporting the, I think, Iraqi resistance, maybe a particular group of the Iraqi resistance, argued that, is it not the same as, let's say, a person in England supporting Israel? And a war that Israel might be doing, or people joining up, or the IDF from England, British citizens joining the IDF, or joining the British army or the American armies in Iraq in an illegal war. That was, I think, the argument actually was made, and in the judgment, the court just found that that's something different, right? Without specifying. So the law was very broad, very, very broad, and it literally could apply to exactly what you've said. But it's only in case law the judges kind of like just say, oh, but we know what it refers to. We know. I
want to point out, if I may just pause here and just change the subject slightly. Talking about the law and people who break the law. Today, this afternoon, of course, famously in the British media, Piers Morgan himself, and I'm now quoting from the Guardian newspaper, you can read it now. Piers Morgan has denied that he was aware of phone hacking during his time as editor of the Daily Mail, after a judge ruled that there can be no doubt that he, Piers Morgan, knew about the practice while he helmed the newspaper. The court heard from many witnesses that Piers Morgan, editor of the Daily Mirror, had known about phone hacking and illegal information gathering. So the multiple witnesses and a court of the land in England have now ruled that he broke the law. So he's a criminal, a lawbreaker as well. And today he lied again in front of the cameras, denying that he'd ever known anything about this, even though multiple witnesses testified in court and the witness was accepted as true testimony that he did know. So he would appear to be a confirmed liar and a breaker of the law in terms of illegal information gathering. So you just mentioned the law here and so on. I just want to slip in that Piers Morgan is a publicly confirmed liar and lawbreaker. And this is the man who has the temerity to lecture others on alleged law breaking. It's interesting, isn't it, that Sky News will employ such a disreputable character to slander and slag off Islamophobically Muslims. I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, but of course you must understand that it's only morally wrong for Muslims to break the law, not for people like right wing and quote unquote right thinking, as they would say, people from breaking law. That's understandable. That's totally acceptable. As they say.
Contextualization. Throughout the show, you compared the bombing of Gaza to the World War II bombing of London, which I think caused Douglas to take quite a bit of umbrage. Is the comparison really apt, though?
Right. So, yeah, the reason I mentioned a comparison of the bombing of Gaza by Israel with the bombing of London during World War II was because I was actually highlighting something. We know that the bombing of London was deliberate. It was indiscriminate and deliberately indiscriminate by the Germans, designed to terrorize the British public into coercing or putting pressure on the British government to surrender or to give up and withdraw from the war, come to terms with the Germans. On the Germans, terms of of agreement, i.e., something favorable to Germany, and this is obviously what we'd call today terrorism, right? Which is using violence against civilians in order for them to change the policy of their government. So the argument by the other side is Israel is not deliberately targeting Gazan civilians. And there is some journalistic work that is out there, which was has done the rounds. Actually, people have actually noticed that some Palestinian and Israeli journalists kind of revealed that there was a kind of a policy done, which is being enacted by Israel today, whereby it has different descriptions of target. It knows who lives in which buildings. It knows how many people live in each building, and it knows exactly how many people will die for each building it targets. And it has acceptable, collateral loss figures in the hundreds, if it means to kill one key Hamas leader. But there are other targets, categories. One is called power targets. And power targets are ones which are defined as civilian targets, which, when targeted, will lead to an exertion of pressure on the Hamas government, right, to surrender, to give up, to what have you. So I was thinking, this was kind of exposed in this very interesting investigative journalism, recent investigative journalism, and of course, what do you call the targeting of civilians to exert pressure on a government, right?
As you've already said about London,
yeah, and that illustrates that there's actually a deliberate policy. So this is by a kind of this is published on a website called +972 magazine, and it's called, the title of the article of the investigation, kind of a publication anyway, it's called "A Mass Assassination Factory Inside Israel's Calculated Bombing of Gaza," published by Yuval Abraham in the 30th of November. So this is investigative journalism is using inside sources inside the Israeli intelligence who currently are operating there, and their kind of discussions with these Israeli journalists and so on who have this inside track, and they uncovered this. This is the Israeli policy, which is the deliberate targeting of civilians. But people like Piers Morgan, possibly people like certainly Douglas Murray, are trying to pretend or argue that Israel does never deliberately target civilians. In fact, Douglas Murray actually argued in that show that I was with him that Israel is not targeting civilians. It might be targeting Hamas fighters. And somehow Israel is like omniscient. It just knows where everyone is. So when they bomb a whole bunch of city blocks in a row, just take their word for it. Their source. Trust me, bro.
The president, the prime minister, and the defense minister have used very extreme language to characterize the Palestinians, and the prime minister Netanyahu invoked the biblical trope of the Amalek, the Amalekites, and Israel's command to exterminate them, and he actually invoked this image. So here, for those who know their Bibles, is actually an incitement to genocide by definition. I mean, there's no speculation. You just go and read the Bible, and there's genocide because there's the targeted killing explicitly of women, children, and babies. It actually says that in 1 Samuel 15 in the Old Testament. So you don't need to be a rocket science to see genocide in that. And the president called the Palestinians as a people, as a whole, human animals. He called them animals. And of course, what do you do with animals? You can slaughter them. And the defense minister said similar things. I mean, at the highest three officers of state, the president, the prime minister, and the secretary of state for defense have made extraordinary statements in general about the Palestinians to dehumanize them and to target them specifically in war. So to say that Israel avoids why would they avoid civilians when they've already characterized them as animals and fit for destruction like the Amalekites? So, it's Saggar's belief that Douglas Murray could argue that, give him all that evidence as well as what you have just said, of course.
Well, I think Douglas Murray's required evidence is that he is literally in the operations room, in front of the console with the bomb with the button on it, and seeing the crosshairs literally, target the building, and seeing someone just press it, saying there are only civilians here, and then press the button. I think that's the kind of evidence he wants. That's the bar that he wants to set it at, as opposed to just using common sense and piecing together the multiple evidences that all seem to support each other in terms of indicating the intent behind the Israeli government. As you pointed out as well, yes, many Israeli politicians and military spokesmen have made very concerning comments. For example, Daniel Hagari, the current Israeli army spokesman, said regarding the operation, the emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy. Right?
Yeah, I remember reading.
A phrase worthy of a German Luftwaffe airman over London. Just it's on damage, not accuracy, because the bombs aren't accurate, right? But it's on damage. Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, he said, as infamously now everyone knows, that it is an entire nation out there that is responsible. So not just Hamas, it's an entire nation. Now, people do say that he specified, but we're not going to target civilians, in that same speech. But when you tell your army and soldiers, or you're just telling the public, that the sentiment that the public should have is that everyone in Gaza is responsible, but don't worry, we're not going to target civilians. Of course not. But we just want to convey to you that everyone there is responsible. Yep. That is where we have to be, very worried. Of course, Yoav Gallant, who you referenced, Israeli Minister of Defense, said there will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. We are fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly. And now people, kind of pro-Israel pro-Israeli individuals, maybe such as Douglas Murray and others, would probably argue that no, they're only referring to Hamas. They're not referring to the Gazans themselves, but they shut off the electricity, food, fuel, water for the whole Gaza Strip, not just obviously for Hamas. Now you might say that they can't isolate Hamas in particular, but if you shut it off collectively for the entire Gaza Strip, and then you're telling the public that, don't worry, this is how you treat human animals, and you don't specify it only Hamas, by the way, you just say, don't worry, this is how we treat human animals. I think anyone with two brain cells can draw the inferences for themselves. But instead of me using those things, because those things are, I know that when I go into such a platform, I won't have much time, and these things are going to be argued and debated and so on and so forth. So I thought I would come with a brand new angle, a different angle, and this was because my mind was wondering about, well, wait a second, from my reading of World War II, I remembered about the Blitz, and that where the Germans systematically bombed cities around UK, and certainly London, the London Blitz. And I thought, well, wait a second, let me just check the statistics on that. I'm just curious, and compare it to Gaza. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Blitz is where Germany indiscriminately bombed London cities with the deliberate intent to kill civilians in order to pressure the English government to
demoralize the population as well, to demoralize them, to give up basically in that state. I just, by the way, sorry, but the historical record shows, and this is actually known in scholarship, although not in the wider public, that the first country in the Second World War to bomb civilian cities was actually Winston Churchill. He ordered a command to bomb Hamburg and Berlin and Dresden and so on first, and Hitler bombed British cities in retaliation. It's very uncomfortable to hear that fact, and it is the historical fact, because we believe passionately that Hitler bombed us first. It was the other way around, and people can check this out for themselves. But I don't want to divert from your perhaps unique comparison. I've not had anyone else yet compare that event with Gaza. It's a very good comparison, actually, because it really helps us to get this thing in perspective.
Well, as I said, because people, and I was waiting for them to try to challenge me on this, like, oh, how dare you make the comparison? And in some ways they did try to, but I have the numbers to back me up on this one. So I was just curious, because in my head I remember some figures from my readings of World War II. I used to read a lot of it when I was much younger, as most people did, I suppose. Well, not that most people did, but World War II is a very it was a war that defined the 20th century. So many things changed after it. So many people's lives were ruined and destroyed after it. So it's clearly it's still in living memory. So I was reading up on it, and I remembered some things from my past reading, and I thought, wait a second. So I looked at the amount of dead reported in London throughout the entire period of World War II due to German bombing and V2 and V1 rockets.
V2 attacks. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. And I looked at Gazan casualties. Now, the current Gazan casualties are reported as being, I mean, just 1 week ago, it was reported as being 300 shy of 18,000 Gazan dead. That was just a week ago. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that it's gone well past into 18,000s.
Yeah.
Would you like to have a guess? And don't worry, you don't have to get it bang on. I didn't know until I looked at the
No, I have
statistics
no
recently.
idea.
Yeah.
I'd assumed it was much more than that, but without any knowledge to back that up. So I don't know the answer. So I'll say, for the sake of saying, it was far higher figure in the London Blitz that died than in the attacks on the Gaza population.
Okay. So throughout the period of from the entire war, right, from 1937 to 1945, we see that the amount of dead is 18,688 dead Londoners due to German bombing from the entire period of the war.
I didn't realize that. So that figure has already been superseded then in Gaza, because that was a week old, those statistics, and the war. And I mean, every day there are more mass atrocities.
So it is quite possible, and because this war is not going to be ending anytime soon.
Right.
But to reframe this, almost as many Gazans have died in 2 months as the total number of deaths that Londoners suffered during the whole of World War II.
Mm-hmm. And London, I think, even then was a much bigger city than Gaza as well. So the absolute numbers proportionately would be higher.
Yeah, and it was dense. I mean, arguably, there's an argument as to about densities, of course, but basically, Israel has bombed Gaza and killed almost as many civilians as the entire amount of civilians that died in London throughout the entire World War II, due to unguided, indiscriminate dropping of bombs by the German Luftwaffe on London. Right.
No,
so
it's very surprising.
And that's where I kind of made the point. Now, also, there about one third of the buildings in London were destroyed to the point of beyond repair.
Mm-hmm.
They say 460 acres in the city of London. Sorry, about one third was destroyed. Now, if you compare this to it was a report by there was a United Nations Institute for Training and Research using satellite data, where they actually have a satellite project of their own, and they looked at the amount of structures. Now, they said that 18% of the total structures in the Gaza Strip, the whole Gaza Strip, right, has been destroyed. But they're mostly located in Gaza City. So that's the entire Gaza Strip. That's not just Gaza City. That's the entire Gaza Strip. So that's 18%. So I think we can reasonably get into the region of, in essence, one third. So one third of the buildings in Gaza City. Some people are reporting 1 in 2, actually, have been destroyed.
In some areas, I'm sure that is the case. In some areas of the city, if not more.
Yeah, and so then the question is, of course, and also just to actually get you, I was just looking at some statistics for. There are numbers of buildings that have been destroyed as well. I don't have them to hand, but they are in a similar, almost to a very similar level of just numbers of buildings that have been damaged, destroyed. Was, I think, in the region of about about 30,000 in London, I think. And in the statistics I have here, in terms of destroyed structures throughout the Gaza Strip itself, it's 37,379 structures. So what we're seeing is it's very comparable, the damage inflicted on Gaza, with the total amount of damage that the German Luftwaffe it meted out upon the city of London throughout 5-6 years of the war, of World War II. Once you understand it like this, it becomes very evident that it's not precise, targeted strikes of Hamas. It's the general bombardment of Gaza and of the city of Gaza itself and Gaza.
You're absolutely right, and we all see in photographs, because of social media now, it's not like before where we just took people's word for it. I had to kind of do the kind of analysis that you have just done, which is excellent work, by the way. Congratulations, very, very good work. And deduce what you've just said logically, which you have done rightly, I think. The photographs, we've all seen photographs of vast areas of the city that be completely flattened. I mean, that's not targeted surgical attacks on individual Hamas. This is flattening an entire civilian population, just like in Dresden or Berlin. Famously, we've seen those terrible pictures of Dresden. That's what it reminded me of. And these places were systematically bombed by the RAF in the Second World War, and hundreds of thousands of civilians died actually in those, actually by fire bombs. It wasn't just the bombing; it was the firebomb. I mean, unspeakable what happened after that. I mean, we've not had that in Gaza, I don't think, that knock-on consequence of the bombing. So, no, so the question was, is a comparison apt? And the comparison is apt, I think.
And very much, I mean, in a shorter amount of time, so it's even more than apt, because the amount of damage that the German Luftwaffe, who were just dropping thousands of bombs onto London over dense areas.
But it's over several years, obviously, and the war on Gaza is just a couple of months. So also, there's that fact. The time factor, it shows how much more extreme the bombing is than at any point during the Second World War on London. It just gets worse the more you look at it. It doesn't in any way get better.
And also, I mean, also was the fact that at one point Hamas said to made a public statement to the Israeli government saying that usually in the past, not during the between flare-ups of violence, between the flare-ups. So we're not even talking about the 2014 Gaza war, or the other one, or many other ones that have happened, or suppressions as I call them. But in between those, during relative peacetime, Israel uses targeted strikes now and again because there's no such thing as just peacetime with it. When you make ceasefire with Israel, they're always opportunistically bombing, hitting targets. They just might not be doing it to a higher frequency during the wartime segments of their interaction with the Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza. But even during so-called ceasefire or peacetime, they are using targeted strikes. But what they usually do is they have they call it a knock on the door. They would shoot a missile which is designed to just make a big loud concussion, and that would reverberate throughout the building to warn people to leave the building, because they're going to destroy the whole building. And so they usually give 10 minutes for everyone to.
That's very, very kind of them, isn't it? Really? I mean,
10 minutes, because 10 minutes is sufficient time for everyone to empty out, an entire building.
All people, babies, the disabled, and everything. You just pop outside, no problem.
Yeah, but this time, when Israel began to launch its strikes, everyone noticed that they weren't doing that, and it got to the point that Hamas even threatened to execute hostages for every building that wasn't given a knock on the door for, as it's called, before destroying it, because of the immense amount of civilian casualties that was being caused. Now, of course, Hamas didn't actually follow through with that threat, because for them the hostages are valuable and they for exchange, and so they wouldn't execute. And plus, it's not as far as from my analysis of the history of Hamas. Execution of hostages is not their method. It's obviously that's more associated with groups like ISIS, who usually do that. And I think that Israel realizes that Hamas is never going to execute hostages, because the hostages are valuable to Hamas, and they wouldn't do so.
It's also under Islamic law. Obviously, it's not permitted to execute hostages or prisoners of war, I should say. But I mean,
yeah.
it is. It would be a crime and a sin as well, Islamically. But if we could perhaps just move on, I noticed you had an interesting approach to answering Pierre Morgan's notorious question, which has been widely mocked on memes all over the social internet: is Hamas a terrorist organization? Could you explain your strategy, what it was, and how you expected Piers to react to this?
Okay. Oh yes. There was one actually another point I wanted to mention. Sorry, my head was I used the argument, sorry, about the comparison of World War II and the Blitz on London with the Gaza bombing, and I used it multiple times during the show. And when Douglas Murray came to try to rebut me on this and said, and he did so by trying to misrepresent what I said. He said, "How can you compare it to the bombing of Dresden? The amount of destruction in Dresden was much worse, and what have you." And I had to basically interrupt. I had to shout, and they were muting my voice a bit. If you look at the video that came on, but I said like, no, I said London. I said London, right? Not Dresden which was the bombing was much worse because of the firebombing by the Allies was much worse.
There's additional factors which we haven't seen in Gaza at all, so the comparison is not really relevant, as you say.
No. So I had to say London, and then he shut up. In essence, he didn't continue with his rebuttal to me on that one issue, and then he moved into something else because as I said, he can't argue against it. He even one point said, "Do I even know anything about World War II?" And I said, "Well, do you know anything about World War II?" Basically, so when I selected London as a city, I did it deliberately after looking at the statistics. So I was ready to defend it. But anyway, so I just wanted to mention that point that that was something I got on Douglas Murray, a little shot off I got on Douglas Murray, which he couldn't respond to.
So there's a question about Piers Morgan's notorious question: is Hamas a terrorist organization? And your strategy in dealing with, because obviously you'd have known in advance this was going to be the question he would throw at you, and how you expected him to react to your strategy. So what happened? What happened?
Well, as I said, the moment I got the call, it was I knew that question was going to come. This is his notorious.
Pierre Morgan wants to ask you: is Hamas a terrorist organization? Do you condemn Hamas, Mr. Abdullah?
Yeah, I mean, there's been speculation that Piers Morgan, years in the future, and on his deathbed, his final words, maybe on his grave, will be, "Do you condemn Hamas?" ? And so on. So yes, I've seen all the memes about it. Anyway, so the issue is that this is a question which is one that should not be taken lightly, and for a clear reason, which is it might seem a straightforward question. But in it, there's a hidden subtext to that question. So when engaging with people who have defended Israel's actions or are refusing to condemn Israel's actions, or even recognize that if Israel targets civilians deliberately for political gain, then well, what is that? Right? What would you call that? And so this is something where if you just go on and you condemn Hamas and they will not reciprocate, then this leaves your kind of argument at a moral disadvantage, because they will say that, look, we all agree that this group is to be condemned, but we don't all agree that Israel is to be condemned. So the lowest common denominator is we just condemn that group and move on, and so on. And this leaves a kind of an imbalance in the political moral discourse, because the real situation is that yes, Hamas have used methods which would be defined as terrorism, such as launching rockets on nearby settlements, which are predominantly indiscriminate, and these are civilian settlements. So this would be something that would fit a definition of terrorism. But the amount of casualties caused by the state of Israel in the West Bank, in Gaza, not just recently, but for the last 75 years, as well as in what is called Israel Proper, quote unquote, during the 1947 ethnic cleansing of Palestine to 1948 and so on and so forth, where 700,000 Palestinians were uprooted, but thousands of Palestinians were killed. Civilians were killed, shot point blank. There's a documentary called Tantura about a town called a seaside village called Tantura, where the civilians were massacred, and the former Haganah soldiers are giving testimony. They're old men now, and they're all laughing and joking about how they saw women be raped, people burnt to death with flamethrowers by the Haganah forces, and so Haganah are the kind of proto IDF or IOF as people call it, the Israeli occupation force. And they were talking about, oh, it was crazy times, but it's war, it's war. This is what they were saying in that actual documentary. So morally speaking, Hamas has done reprehensible things, but Hamas and the state of Israel are not on the same level, right? That's where we would agree with the pro-Israeli advocates, but we would agree with them not in the way they'd like, which is, they're not on the same level, because the state of Israel and the government of Israel has killed far more civilians than Hamas has done. And if we believe that all life, all human life, is intrinsically equal to all the human life, so one person's life is equal to another person's life, then a person that kills 10 people is worse, or has done more egregious sin, more egregious wrongdoing than someone that just kills one person. If we take that, we take those principles to be the case, then morally speaking, Israel killing tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians for the last 75 years makes it out to be far worse than the amount of civilians that was killed on the other side. It doesn't justify the killings of any civilians, but the organization that has done the most wrongdoing by objective numbers of lives is clearly the Israeli government, and the proto-Israeli government, which was before the state of Israel was declared independent, and certainly the proto-IDF, the Haganah and Irgun and others, who all actually form part of the IDF. People say the Irgun and the Lehi were recognized by the British as being terrorist organizations, and they joined the IDF. They all became subsumed into it. So this is a matter of historical record. There's no controversy on this one.
That's true. Yeah.
So now this is my thinking behind what I would next do when I answer the question, which is I'm not going to play the game of being asked to condemn, and then the conversation's moved on, and we're left with this imbalance in the discourse. It should be the case that the first organization or group or state to be condemned is Israel, because it has killed more civilians objectively. Objectively speaking, it's killed more civilians. So instead, I wanted to, in an almost Socratic dialogue, I was going to ask Piers something that he didn't expect, which is, so he would say, do you think Hamas is a terrorist organization? And I say, okay, well, let's get down to principles in this. And say, okay, what do you mean by terrorism? What do you mean by terrorist organization?
I remember. Yeah.
Can you define it? Yeah. And I had a plan. I had almost a flow chart in my head of where the logical possibilities we can go with this. Right. So if he said it's people who target civilians to affect a political goal, then I say, okay, then do you agree that the Allies and Germany as well were committed terrorist actions when they deliberately targeted civilians in what they call terror bombing to affect political change, i.e. to get the governments of the respective governments of the different target countries to surrender, to be demoralized and to give up, and so on and so forth. And this obviously asks a question of Winston Churchill's character, which is where Piers Morgan probably doesn't want to go and question. And then later on, the next step would be to ask, okay, and now is Israel a terrorist organization because it does deliberately target civilians? And just recently, even President Biden of the United States of America, For those who don't know, he described Israel's bombing as indiscriminate, which has been equated in international law to indiscriminate bombing of civilian targets is the same as intent to target civilians. Hamas's unguided rockets against Israeli settlements are indiscriminate because they're not guided, right? So, and we call that terrorist because it is indiscriminate. And so if that's the case, then we must apply the same to Israel. And I think Piers Morgan knew where it was going. Perhaps he had an inkling that, oh, this is going to go in. Once we get a definition nailed down, it's not going to go where I want to go. And so I said, is it killing civilians? Is it targeting of civilians? And people pointed out to me, I said at the beginning of the show, and he said, okay, let's move on, right? He said, let's move on, try to avoid it. He started to play the evasive game. And Douglas Murray, when Piers Morgan phoned his friend, Douglas Murray said, oh, well, the definition of terrorism is the deliberate targeting of in civilians, the intent to target civilians, as if that would help them. Because I then said in my kind of follow-up question when we had the second round with Piers Morgan on that subject, I said, okay, is the deliberate targeting of civilians, by a state or whoever, is that terrorism? And then he said, no, that's not what I mean. And he tried to, and everyone realized at that moment that what did Piers Morgan just say? The deliberate targeting of civilians isn't terrorism. And then he thought he could then make a special exception for the Allies' conduct against Germany. He said that, well, it was justified to target civilians against the German state because of who they were fighting. It was the Nazis. The Nazis had committed a Holocaust. They'd killed, millions of people. So it was justified to target their civilians.
But that wasn't the reason. The bomber Harris, who was head of the RAF at the time, and Churchill, Prime Minister at the time, never mentioned the Holocaust. That wasn't the reason they bombed German cities at all. This is anachronistic reinvention, revisionist history, which we're not supposed to do. The reason was, as was stated, to demoralize, degrade the German industrial and war machine. It had nothing to do with the Holocaust at all.
Oh, of course, and I think. I think Piers Morgan, when he kind of played that card saying, well, the Nazis were evil, that's why we can then target German civilians, non-German, non-combatants, innocent Germans who are not part of the Nazi party. They're just, women, children, whatever, babies. Before he could play this card that, oh, well, the Nazis were so bad that it is merited that you can target them. And I pointed out something to him that I don't think he even bothered to research. Which is, I said, well, did the Allies fight the Nazis because of the Jews?
No.
And you're like, what? And that became a meme. So people made it into a meme when he goes, what? Or like, huh? And I said, did Winston Churchill's ultimatum to Hitler, did it mention the persecution of the Jews?
No.
Like, get out of Czechoslovakia. Okay. And was it also stop persecuting Jews? No. And so I said, don't pretend that the war was fought because of the Holocaust or the persecution of the Jews. They only discovered the death camps after the war had been initiated, after the kind of the death camps, started to kind of operate. Then that was when you saw it. And of course, as you pointed out as well, that Britain initiated the bombing of Germany, and he actually did so. Most historians would say they did so because I think a few German bombs accidentally hit some civilian buildings in England, and Winston Churchill decided to argue it was deliberate and they should bomb the German cities in retaliation, when it wasn't actually intended by the Nazis, according to many historians. And then Hitler actually was surprised that obviously German cities were being bombed because the understood, law of warfare between European states.
Well, it was a crime then. Even then, it was a crime to do that.
Yeah. And the understood law of warfare between civilized nations, quote unquote, a big quote unquote, was that you don't target each other's civilians. I mean, you can target the civilians of people of imperial possessions around the world. That's fine, but not each other. Not with each other. So yeah, I pointed this out, and of course, they had nothing to say back to that, and it kind of called, because he didn't want to condemn Churchill, he didn't want to condemn Bomber Harris or their allies, for the indiscriminate bombing of German civilians, and to call them terrorists, because that is literally what they were doing by the definition of what terrorism is, or the more acceptable, international understanding of it, which is just violence, but a specific type of violence directed towards civilians, specifically to induce political change or pressure of the government. So, and after that, a lot of people were calling, because people were calling to kind of boycott the show after they saw Dr. Abdul-Wahid's treatment, and the differential treatment between Ben Shapiro and let's say, and Dr. Abdul-Wahid and other Muslims, and how Mark Regev and all these other Israeli ministers and others, politicians who go on, are given plenty of time to speak uninterrupted. They might as well just become their show, while they're speaking. Let's go ahead to talk. Whereas the Muslims interrupted, every 20 seconds or every 25 seconds or something like this, or even less. So once people saw that Piers Morgan couldn't call a spade, and even tried to justify the targeting of civilians when it was his heroes doing it, they saw that they saw that, well, he's lacking principles. Then it's just now.
You say lacking principle, and you're right. But as I've already said, I don't mean to be a broken record on this, but a judge today in a British court ruled that there was absolutely no doubt that Piers Morgan knew about the criminal practice of phone hacking and illegal information gathering. That's a quote from today's Guardian. So I don't know if Piers Morgan's going to be arrested and charged, but a judge has already declared that he is basically a criminal. So we shouldn't be surprised that perhaps as a character in general, he's a crook and a liar, according to this judge.
Well, as I said, I'll have to read the court case and the notes and things, but this is. I think a lot of things are coming out about Piers Morgan this week, more than he anticipated, it would seem. But
it's a tip of the iceberg. Of course, all the commentators in the media now, BBC and so on, Times, are saying this is the tip of the iceberg, and it's going to be a further unraveling of revelations. This is not a discrete, isolated case at all, because Prince Harry, who brought the case against the Mirror in the first place, has broken the dam. He's broken through this wall of conspiracy of silence about this, and successfully done it. So this is a momentous moment, actually, in British press history, and I can't think that people like Piers Morgan are going to survive it, to be honest. And so they'll go down, basically, I think, ultimately. But I mean, characters like that, they make what you're describing here is someone who lacks principle, as you say. But it's not just on this issue. It seemed to be a more general character issue to do with his whole life, it seems.
Yeah, possibly. But as I said, I've only known Piers Morgan by what I see, how he's acted on his TV shows, and he uses aggressive tactics to interrogate people, and this is what he became obviously renowned and famous for. And as I said, I didn't anticipate that he'd have, maybe he'll have a Damascene moment, and he will see the light, quote unquote, and see the error.
Christian metaphor there, yeah.
A Christian metaphor, yes, of course, appropriate for Muslims to use. But I didn't anticipate it, and so when I went on that show, I knew that he initially was going to ask me these questions, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to counterattack. I'm going to put him on the defensive. I'm going to put him on the back foot, because he does not have the moral high ground. His principles are not the moral high ground. I actually have more principles than him on this, because I would condemn any action against targeting civilians for whichever intent, no matter who does it or who it's done to. It is all to be condemned. So that's my cast iron principle. And I, alhamdulillah, I got the opportunity to state that on the show, that the Islamic ruling on is that you're not allowed to target civilians, even if, according to Ibn Qayyim al-Jawzi, who expressed it more explicitly, you could say the formula, in the case that the enemy are deliberately targeting your civilians, he said even then, it's not allowed to target their civilians to make them feel pain as you're feeling pain. Even when they're targeting your civilians, you're still not allowed to target their civilians. And this is the cast iron rule. Even Catholicism has this as the rule of double effect. They have a prohibition against targeting civilians. And this is something that I've spoken about a lot in Western political philosophy, because in secular liberalism, there is a exemption to the rule. So unlike Islam, unlike Catholicism, Western political philosophy, its most dominant streams, believe in an exemption to the rule. It's called the supreme emergency exemption. It's when that if your very existence as a political state or community, what have you, or even physically, is threatened, and you can see some victory or some means of getting victory in some way through targeting the enemy's civilians, then you can do so. So it's called the supreme emergency exemption. And key thinkers have justified this from John Rawls, he defines modern liberalism, John Rawls, to Michael Walzer, who famously actually came up with that formula from extrapolating from World War II as an example. So liberalism allows you to target civilians in supreme emergencies. And when the conversation with Piers Morgan ended kind of on this way, he said, look, we were fighting the Nazis and what they're doing. I said, well, you weren't fighting them because you were defending Jews. You were just fighting them. And he says, oh, but they were a threat to our way of life, our democracy, or what have you. And I said, well, using your logic, basically, what do you think the Palestinians are doing? Basically, like using your logic, right? What do you think the Palestinians are defending themselves from? Right? They're defending themselves from being denied the right to self-determination on their own land, right? Politically being wiped out, in essence, right? Something that actually the right to self-determination is one of the highest principles accepted in international law, and it was even mentioned in the mandate of Palestine under the League of Nations, that this is something that the nations, especially in the nations of the former Ottoman Empire, said have a right to. So I said to Piers Morgan, using your logic, I could then say the Palestinians are doing the same thing. And the point of all this discussion is to throw it back upon them, to show that he's inconsistent, that he's being hypocritical. And I got to tell him to his face, you're being hypocritical. And it ended the discussion. It was no longer me being interrogated. It was me interrogating him. Someone jokingly said on Twitter, it was glad to see Piers Morgan on Abdullah's show, right? Abdullah Al-Andalusi's show.
That's an amazing outcome. Well done for that. Perhaps we can move on to the 13th of December. This is the third of the four shows, and this one was a panel debate between Norman Finkelstein and Alan Dershowitz. When does Israel's defense become terror? This was the subject. When does Israel's defense become terror? And I was going to ask if you think Piers was fair to the Palestinian side of the debate. I think we can know the answer to that because we know what his character is. But was it a beneficial discussion? Were there any good points to this? Because there is the issue. I'm going to come to that a bit later about whether or not Muslims should be on these platforms anyway. Should we be boycotting him? Is there any benefit to Muslims, however skilled they may be, like yourself, going on at all in the first place? But we'll come to that in a minute. But nevertheless, what was this particular panel discussion, this particular show, beneficial, do you think?
Well, this show was, Norman Finkelstein and Alan Dershowitz. Basically, there were no Muslims on the show. No. I mean, because it's still the pro-Palestinian side, but someone might say that Piers Morgan's actually being consistent, because in this case he was a bit fairer, and there were no Muslims on the actual.
That's because both his guests were Jewish, of course. Even though one was pro-Palestinian, one was definitely Zionist.
And I mean, as I said, that show is lucky to even get the agreement of Norman Finkelstein to.
I know. I mean, he's such a titan. I mean, he's an incredible man. Actually, his knowledge is probably unparalleled, actually, amongst the pro-Palestinian English-speaking voices. Anyway, yeah.
And so I watched it. I watched it with great alacrity, and it was, as I said, Norman Finkelstein, his knowledge, his eloquence,
Exactly.
his passion is unparalleled. As I said, I don't think there's anyone quite like him,
Yeah.
arguing on the pro-Palestinian side. And as I said, it was impressive. He was
Yeah.
allowed to speak generally.
Yeah, I noticed that. I mean, Piers did actually shut up. I mean, it would be extremely rude because this, I mean, Finkelstein has great gravitas. That's the word. Great presence, and it would have been very rude, I think, if he had just interrupted him like that. I mean, he was rude anyway to everyone else, but Muslims, I mean. But for some reason, he seemed to have a little bit of respect for him.
Yes, yeah, and as I said, like Norman Finkelstein, he doesn't have to speak fast. He goes his own pace. But even then, it's really engaging, and you're really eager to see, what's he going to say next, and what's he going to lead to next. And he made some amazing points, and points which I'm really glad to see go out there, because most people don't realize this. For example, I'm just going to just pick one thing, but there's so many gems, and I would advise everyone just to go watch the episode for themselves. Because there's only two people on there, and Piers clearly didn't know any. I mean, Piers, for all his reading, if he does read much on the Palestine matter, more than just looking at the news.
We haven't established yet that he has read anything on the subject, have we?
No, I don't think we have established that. We'll defer that investigation to maybe his next court case, whether he actually knows what he's talking about before he talks about it. And whether he's a responsible journalist when talking about such topical issues as he does. So basically, Alan Dershowitz he considers himself to be Israel's lawyer, right? I think he mentioned that, like Israel's defense attorney.
Wow.
He's written books arguing for the Zionist case, and arguing that all these allegations against Zionism is factually incorrect, or Zionism has a moral and legal strong case for why they get to control the whole land of Palestine, and not the Palestinians, who were the majority and are actually still the majority now in the entire land of Palestine, the mandate of Palestine, as it was called. So what we kind of see is there was discussion, and Alan Dershowitz brings out this typical Zionist trope, and the trope is this, which is we've approached the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, with a peace deal for a two-state solution. They've always turned it down. They've always rejected it. We've always been people offering peace, and they've always been turning it down. Now, what they don't mention, of course, is that what do they mean by offering a peace deal? Because the Palestinians have always been saying that we want the West Bank and Gaza, the pre-1967 borders, before the war of 1967, where Israel unilaterally invaded and annexed these lands before they were physically attacked by anybody. They say that just give us back those lands, and leave us to our own devices. Israel never offers that. Instead, it offers this kind of an archipelago of disjointed patches through West Bank.
That's right. Yeah, I've seen the maps. They are remarkably disjointed. They don't join up. They're not continuous, and it's quite bizarre that any Palestinian would agree to these arbitrary bits of unconnected land, which were the Palestinians anyway. But yeah,
and people have pointed out that basically, the along with those offers on the maps, the lands that the Palestinians are given, they're not allowed to have an air force. They're not allowed to have an army. Their foreign relations are still controlled by the state of Israel. And there's even between them and Jordan, basically the Jordan Valley, between the West Bank and where these reservations, one might call them, or ghettos, if you, for want of other word, are situated. There's a gap between them and Jordan, not just the Jordan River, but also there's the Jordan Valley.
I was actually there in October. I saw Jericho from a distance, from the River Jordan side. Yeah. Anyway.
And on that valley, Israel wants to keep military presence there, so that valley will never go to the
Well, the military are
Palestinians.
definitely there. I saw them. They're definitely there. Yeah.
And so, I mean, the Palestinians, why would they ever accept that? That's not to freedom. That's just basically, they just signed their name to being on reservations. That's all that's been offered to them.
Yeah.
But Norman Finkelstein came in with, from left field, as the Americans would say, with pointing out the obvious. I have a friend of mine that famously says, sometimes the hardest thing to explain to people is the bleedingly bloody obvious, as he says, right? With his London vernacular.
We don't speak like that. Anyway.
Yeah, but you're the posh central Londoners, not the west side. And
I think you and I live in the same London borough, but that's let's not go there.
Anyway, yeah, sorry, we won't be in class in this discussion. Anyway, so all right, so Norman Finkelstein just says, look, you say that Israel's offered these peace deals, and the Palestinians always rejected it, and the Zionists always omit that these peace deals are not deals for justice, because what the Palestinians want is justice, because you can't have peace without justice, right? And that's very important. Because obviously, if you're an oppressor and you've taken over a land, of course you want peace, because you've got what you wanted. You've stolen the thing you wanted. So now you want people to leave you alone to enjoy what you've stolen, right? Yeah. Whereas if something's been taken from you, and then you say, oh, don't worry, I've stolen your car, your house, and what have you. You can stay in the garden shed. But look, I offer you peace. It's like, wait, I want my stuff back, please. Yeah. I want to, I don't want to live in the garden shed, to which you'll be called, oh, you're so ungrateful, and what, do you hate my race? It's like, no, it's not your race I hate. I'm not a great. I just want to live in the land, the place I was living before, be great, Anyway, so Norman Finkelstein points out from a different angle. He just says, look, every single year, right, in the UN there is a vote. Right, a vote for the peaceful resolution of the Palestine question, right? And every single year, the vast majority of the international community vote for peace with a two-state solution within the recognized borders of 1967, including the representative of the state of Palestine, right? Supported by the state of Palestine, which is the Palestinian Authority, which is basically based in West Bank, but they claim authority over, obviously, Gaza too. And every single year, without fail, it's opposed by a very tiny minority of countries that have a wild guess who they are, of course.
I can possibly guess.
Yes, United States and Israel. Every single year since the 1970s and so on. So this outweighs. So the Zionists is saying, we made a few peace deals you can count on your hand. We offer peace offers, and you're not accepting it. Whereas every single year, the Palestinians have accepted the United Nations approved a peace resolution, and it has always been opposed by Israel and the United States of America, because they want to keep the possessions in the West Bank. They don't want to give it away, and they don't want to give full sovereignty to the Palestinians, and they want to keep them into what it was called under apartheid South Africa, Bantustans, separate sovereign states that only South Africa recognizes. South African Boer, white Boer government. They have their own sovereignty, but they are trapped, landlocked in South Africa, and in very small areas, and disconnected and disjointed, and so on and so forth. For the majority of the people of South Africa, which is just ridiculous. So I felt that was actually a good show, because Norman Finkelstein, I mean, you couldn't interrupt him because there's only two people, and Piers Morgan doesn't know much about the whole conflict as deep as these two giants. I mean, when I say Alan Dershowitz is a giant, I don't describe him as a giant in terms of the moral position, but rather just in the amount of studying and reading he's done, which clearly he has done a lot of studying and reading, and is a lawyer as well. So that was a good discussion, and it was beneficial, I think.
Excellent. Well, that's good. So the last of the four notorious or famous videos are studio debates. 14th of December, which was yesterday, and this was an interview with Dili Hussein of the Five Pillars Muslim news agency, British Muslim. And the question is, it's ironic, really, because Piers Morgan himself was hosting a show about should we boycott Piers Morgan himself. So rather amusing. What were your thoughts about the interview with Dili?
So yeah, this program was an interview. So it was only Piers Morgan and Dili Hussein, much like on Tuesday when it was just Piers Morgan and Dr. Abdul Wahid.
Right.
My appearance on the show was as part of a panel of there was at least in total 4 people in total, basically.
Right.
So in this interview, Dili Hussein thankfully obviously had more time to discuss different points because he's not jostling with other people around and what have you. And of course, even I would say in my segment, in my show, with Douglas Murray, he was brought in, made his piece, and then left, and literally just left. And there was no possibility to respond to him with him being there because he was just brought in, and they got protected time, which ate up into the time of the show. But in yesterday's show, thankfully, it was just Piers Morgan and Dili Hussein having the their back and forth. Now you'd think that, of course, Dili Hussein would then have more time, and in a sense, he did. Well, he did have more time to speak because there's not competing with other people, and there was no protected time given to a person coming from coming in from remotely, what have you. But he was interrupted a lot by Piers Morgan. Quelle surprise!
What a surprise!
Yeah.
I love it when you break into French halfway through this conversation. It reminds me of my time in France. Thank you for that.
N'est-ce pas? Okay, well, that's what we. That's I thought I'd make it more continental, not just.
I feel more at home. Yeah.
As an English person, that's what I don't. Well,
you used to own half of France until the terrorists, i.e., the French, dared to take that back. Anyway, that's this diversion.
Oh dear, your mind still went to the 100 Years' War, huh? Still back then. Right, okay.
The good old days.
The good old days. Okay. Yes. Anyway, so yeah. So in essence, I was when I saw it live, because it came on live. I noticed there was some jumps. Like, well, that's a bit weird. Was that a skip there? Was that a jump there? I didn't like. It seemed like something was missed out. And when I saw the live version, I felt there was a lot that should have been said or could have been said, or that I thought I would expect to have been said by Dili, until I saw online that Dili posted on Twitter that that wasn't the full discussion. That it's cut. It was redacted and so on, and then Talk TV then published the full version. Now, whether they were going to publish the full version anyway, because they sometimes they do, they not sometimes, but they do tend to publish a separate version that's just the one segment of something, one particular show, and just by itself, rather than the live stream kind of version, which is like an hour or so in it, and it has multiple shows in it. Right. So whether they were going to do that anyway, or they did it out of response to Diddy, I don't know. But the full version was much more interesting and did have their arguments that I was expecting Diddy to make. So in the fuller version, so that was something which was a bit more fuller than the version that was live. So yeah, I felt that Diddy was interrupted, but he did manage to make a number of points because it was just him and Piers Morgan. And he raised some interesting questions. And one of those questions was that the difference of treatment between Muslims and non-Muslims that Piers Morgan kind of seems to do in his shows, but also and quite keyly the suspicion of anti-Islamic sentiments that Piers Morgan exhibits, including his description of Muslim women when apparently Dili and Piers Morgan has had the history, I think in 2019 during the protest against LGBTQ literature and education in Birmingham. in Birmingham schools. And in that interaction, Piers Morgan said that in response to Dilly arguing that, look, the Muslim parents should have a right to decide what their children read, what they're exposed to, because well, and as I've always said as well, and I totally agree with, which is the British state, if it's meant to be secular, it's meant to be neutral, morally neutral. It's not meant to tell people what is good and bad in terms of morals. It just says, here's the law, stay within the law. Now, and teach kids his maths, his physics, his chemistry, his literature, and so on and so forth. But to tell students that same-sex marriage is morally equal to what they call, quote unquote, traditional marriage, which is just basically marriage between opposite sex,
normal marriage.
Normal marriage. That is taking a position. That's taking a moral position. If you're going to be neutral, then don't talk about marriage, what marriage should look like in terms of it. Then stay away. Just teach these subjects of maths, English literature and chemistry and blah blah blah. Why are you getting involved in telling students what is morally acceptable? And of course, I've also argued previously that because some people might say in response, well, marriages happen, so we should tell kids about the kinds of marriages that can happen in the world. I say, okay, all right, if that's the case, then teach kids that about polygamy as well, because polygamy happens. All right.
Of course they won't.
Yeah, of course, because they're not consistent, right? That's the thing.
Well, because they were never serious in the first place. It was always they're presenting a set of values which are not reflecting a reality. It's just it's an ideology that's not reflecting reality. Anyway, but,
so. In response to that, Piers Morgan says, look, this is not Islamabad, right? This is like, basically this is England, not Islamabad. And that was quite offensive to many people, because like, why are you bringing in Pakistan and Islamabad into this? There are many what are called traditional minded British people who are not the children of immigrants, quote unquote, I think, which is what he's kind of meaning. Who believe in these traditional values.
Of course, right? Traditional Catholics, evangelicals, Orthodox Jews, even some atheists actually are still traditionalists, actually, believe it or not.
But juxtapose the Ben Shapiro interview.
That's true.
On gay marriage, right? And you'll see a difference. So I think Dilly kind of held him to task on that to an extent. Although Piers Morgan, I feel, was very, and maybe people have expressed this online, that he invited Dilly Hussein because of this hashtag was called boycott Piers Morgan.
Of course.
He was concerned that he might lose a lot of cannon fodder. Muslim guests, future Muslim guests.
Well, he might lose more than his future Muslim guests, as a judge has just stated, as I repeated for the third time now. There can be no doubt that he knew about the practice of illegal phone hacking, illegal information gathering, which means he could be prosecuted. Hopefully, he will be for criminal offences as well. So we shall see, and the expectation is that he will be prosecuted.
Well, we shall see on that one.
I keep on saying it's such interesting news that this character who presents himself as presenting values and whatever he pretends to present is actually has been called a crook and a liar by a judge just now. I mean, earlier today. I mean, in Britain. So that's the character we're dealing with.
Well, as I said, this
I said it 3 times now, but I just can't. I can't get over this. That finally, the wheels of justice grind exceedingly slowly, but maybe they are grinding nonetheless.
Well, 3 times a charm, as they say.
So I interrupted you in your exposition.
No, I mean that was it, really. I mean, as I said, I felt that Dilly was able to raise some points and interrogate, Piers. Rather than just being the recipient of interrogation. But of course, Piers brought out the age-old question: do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn what happened on the 7th of October? And
as you say, he was saying that on his deathbed to the angel of death, as the angel of death arises. Do you condemn Hamas? But Piers denied did he not, Dili Hussein's description of the Israeli operation in Gaza as being a genocide. And he argued, it's an interesting argument, it's an absurd argument, but it's interesting because I've not heard it before, that if Israel really wished to commit genocide, it would have simply have deployed nuclear weapons. Now, it's easy to refute this. I said, how would you respond to it? I mean, I'm just laughing because obviously it's such a silly point to make, but perhaps you could just go through the motions and explain why it's such a silly point to make.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, as you mentioned to me before, the show began, which is, and as anyone, you don't need to have knowledge of advanced nuclear physics to answer this, which is if you detonate a nuclear bomb right next to your own territory, there's winds, right? And there's fallout, radioactive fallout, and it's going to go blowing back into your own population's faces and going to cause cancer and a whole number of deformities. It is ridiculous as well. And of course, you can't use the land afterwards for many years because it's just a radioactive crater.
It's not called the Gaza Strip for nothing. It's a tiny strip of land. If you drop a nuclear bomb on that, half of Israel, over half of the Middle East, or all the Middle East, will be affected by it. So this is hardly, it's a silly question, a nuclear weapon, honestly, please. A serious objection. But just moving on there, it's such a silly point. But after Piers' interview, Dr. Abdul Wahid and many so after Piers' interview with Dr. Abdul Wahid, many people have been calling for a boycott of his platform. And I must admit, I tend to agree with that. I think it's so one-sided, it's so unfair, it's so tendentious. And as I've already pointed out, this man has just been publicly accused by a British judge of being a liar and a criminal, that perhaps we really shouldn't be appearing on this guy's show, even if this show is not going to be around for much longer if he gets prosecuted. But I think you obviously appeared on his show, so you think there might be merit on appearing. What might the argument be for suitably skilled and knowledgeable people, Muslims, to appear on his show?
Well, look, I'm not going to issue an edict on this matter. This is just my opinion, and if people disagree with it, that's fine. It's fine. I mean, there's no real cast iron rule on this really, because it's just basically you have to judge it and play it by ear, right. And that is this. There, Muslims, we have many good platforms, many popular platforms. For example, I'm on one now, alhamdulillah, and these are good platforms for teaching Muslims and having time where we can elaborate on Islamic discourses, on opinions, and express ideas without interruption, and so on and so forth. But this is a community bubble in a way. Even though we live on the internet where anyone can access anything, and I am also very conscious from looking at the comment sections on Blogging Theology that many non-Muslims frequent this channel, and they frequent other Muslim channels as well. So yes, of course, but there is still but due to algorithms online, there is still the tendency of echo chambers to arise.
Oh, this is fair enough. Yeah.
And this question was brought up to me when I appeared on Piers Morgan's show last year. Although at that time Piers Morgan was away. Ironically, I think he was. I say ironically, I don't know what's going to happen to him after this, but he was in prison. Not in prison as an inmate. No. He was, I believe, in America researching or in speaking to U.S. prison inmates.
Perhaps getting a taste of what it'd be like when he goes. Do you think maybe that was the point?
No, I might have completely misheard, because that's what the showrunners told me. So I maybe I misheard and I'm completely wrong. But anyway, that's what I was told. Okay. So he wasn't there at the time. So they had a guy called Jeremy Kyle step in to take his place as the show host. And it was just after the stabbing of Salman Rushdie, and they brought me on, of course, and they to ask the question. Now it wasn't Hamas this time.
Hamas? Oh no,
yeah. no. It was do you condemn Iran? I believe was the one. Even though there's no proof that there was a connection between that Iran initiated the attack. I mean, this might have been demonstrated subsequently. But I was arguing the show. Look, I'm going to wait for the investigation results, and then I will say when the investigation results come out. Right now, it's just speculation, and they say, oh, but there's a fatwa and there's money on the head of Salman Rushdie, and it's like, well, look. I think the fatwa has actually been kind of quietly revoked. I was hearing, but the money on his head. I mean, it's a bit pointless to offer money for someone to kill someone when they're going to go to jail for the rest of their life. You know, they can't really use it. But anyway, I simply said, look, I'm not gonna say anything until the investigation is complete and there's a police investigation and what have you. That's as simple as that. Then when we discover who's to blame. And I actually pointed out, because Douglas Murray was coming in via video link, as he always does, it seems, with my encounters with him recently, that I said, look, Douglas Murray said about the Christchurch shooter. He said that when people raise the issue that, well, maybe some of your rhetoric is to blame, Douglas Murray, about what you say about Muslims, because the Christchurch shooter seems to have read your work as well as other works of individuals, it was believed. And he argued in an article that the only person to blame is the perpetrator. And it's his choice, his decision. No one forced him to do it. So what I said in that show is, well, according to Douglas Murray's logic, the only person to blame is the perpetrator and no one else, right? And I also used the opportunity to argue against him because he was given obviously his long monologue at the beginning, his long soliloquy, one might say, at the beginning of the show, that free speech is important, must protect free speech. And then when I was asked to speak, I said, well, before I go answer the question, I want to just say this very quickly. Douglas Murray has had a history of calling for restrictions on and preventing Muslims from speaking at universities, Muslim speakers and others, intellectuals, others, and restrictions upon Muslims and what they can do and what they can say. In various degrees, whether it's social restrictions or political or actual legal restrictions. So in essence, I said he's a hypocrite. He's not a free speech martyr or free speech hero or a free speech what have you, as he might portray himself to be in his mind. He is a hypocrite. He, as is typical with the right wing, they won't want to see the left wing banned and Muslims, expressing main Orthodox Islam prohibited from doing so. As evident recently by him wanting to ban a non-violent organization like Hizb ut-Tahrir, actually, ironically, and the left wing want to cancel or ban, right wing speakers and others, and sometimes even Muslims as well, for the same reasons as their right wing cousins, should we say? So I said, don't talk about free speech because you're just basically, it's very hypocritical. And he absolutely lost it. He got angry and he said, "What a weasel you are! You're a weasel."
A weasel. That's a
yeah.
Actually, I mean, he can be very bitchy. When he wants to be very catty. I mean, I could say something more about being catty and who he is, but that's probably enough for the time being. But it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. And so what some people, so I just basically look at, I'll play the moral high ground, and just because I don't usually engage in ad hominems for the point of I want to keep the topic on the subject at hand. I might describe people's behavior, but to describe someone as a toad or weasel or whatever, what have you. Or by the way, he called me a blowhard recently as well. So
blowhard. What's a blowhard?
I don't know, an arrogant or narcissistic person. I think I had to.
I don't even know the meaning of that, but that's just
yeah, he's quite creative with his semi-archaic insults. Anyway,
I've just looked it up. It's a derogatory term that people look it up for themselves. It's again another petty insult that's not really worthy of a serious speaker on these issues. But anyway,
yeah. So when I went on the show and he was just basically allowed to kind of just insult, just use ad hominem against me, and I was laughing at the show because it was petty, and I was laughing at how childish he was. So like some people commented after that show, they said, there's no benefit to going on these shows because look how they disrespect you, and look how they disrespect Muslims, and don't go on those shows. And I will tell you the same thing. I will tell your audience and yourself the same thing I said back then in response to there was a prominent, a YouTuber who kind of made a comment about this, and he kind of was arguing what was the utility of going on such shows. And I said, look, they have the right wing and many others have their own echo chambers, and there are many people who listen to these pundits, these right wing pundits and left wing pundits and others, who don't know any better, right? And they haven't heard a contrary voice, a dissenting voice. So if I can break in, and if many other Muslims can break into these echo chambers, and yes, they might try to insult, denigrate, limit, interrupt. In my case, with just this week, as I was responding, I was actually kind of saying some things to correct and fact check Douglas Murray while he was speaking. They actually muted my voice a few times while he was speaking, because they want to give him his unprotected time to speak. And then literally after he finished, they just say, "All right, okay, bye, Douglas, thank you. Okay, now on to something else." It's like, well, wait a second. I want to respond to Douglas. I have a refutation of Douglas ready, But they say, "Oh, well, he's gone, so he responded to you, and that's refuted you now." And so there you go. So, well, but I have a counter that will expose his claims. So I said, despite all these things, there will be a limited amount of time where you can get a few shots in, so to speak, proverbially, lest anyone misconstrue that, of course. You can get a few.
I might edit that bit out.
Yeah. Okay. I'll rewind it, right? So despite the limited amount of time you get, you will still get some time to drop a few nuggets of wisdom, a few gems in there to do some damage to the narrative.
I hear what you're saying, and I'm generally against. I'm all for boycotting his platform. I think, however, you have presented a fairly strong case, but it would only, from my point of view, the person coming on to a Piers Morgan platform would have to have all the relevant skills and knowledge and personality as well to be able to stand up to his bullying sometimes. I mean, you really got to be a very skilled, talented person to make it work. I'm not saying you weren't that person, by the way, but I think ordinarily people shouldn't go on unless they are very well equipped to be successful, or at least strike home some points, what you call these drops of wisdom. And I guess then a case could be made, but there aren't that many people around. I mean, it's not Speaker's Corner. We're dealing here with television, and you can't just rant. You've got to be understood. You've got to score some points, and if you've got the skill set to do that, not many people have, then I guess a case can be made. But I would still say generally, I think people shouldn't go on because they're just going to be, churned up in his machine and spat out again. But maybe you have a case.
Well, I mean, the problem is, as the Dunning-Kruger effect it kind of illustrates, although it's actually commonly misunderstood, but I use a reference to because people understand this, which is the rule is the least you know, the more confident you are. Right? As
ignorance is bliss, or even a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I think that's probably a good saying as well, because then you think you know it all. Actually, you're just beginning the journey of knowledge. And the irony is, the more you know, as Isaac Newton said, I'm just standing on the shoulders of giants. He recognized his own ignorance, even though he knew more than anyone else, because he could see so much further. He could understand what he didn't know in the vast scheme of things. Anyway, but yeah.
Well, as I said, I'm thankful that my show wasn't an interview, so it wasn't just me and Piers Morgan, having an intimate conversation. It was I was obviously jostling with a number of panelists, but there were obviously two Muslim brothers who this week managed to have that one-on-one interview, which was Dilly and Dr. Abdul Wahid. But even in my kind of the segment that I was speaking in with all these panelists, I managed to say a number of things, and I felt, looking at the feedback from many Muslims, that they benefited from learning things that they didn't know necessarily. Like, for example, that the Allies never fought the Germans due to for the sake of Jews and rescuing Jews. It was not done for that reason. That seems to be the reason that was kind of post hoc presented as the ennobling reason behind the Allies' motivations, but it wasn't, right? Because anti-Semitism was rife. They didn't care. Not just the fact that the Allies didn't fight the Germans because of rescuing Jews, but also, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, even tried to suppress the reports in American newspapers before the conquest of Germany was finalized, to play down reports of the massacres against Jews in the U.S. Press, and also, many Jewish refugees were turned away from Western countries, and instead it was, no, send them to Palestine. It should be the Palestinians that, they're the ones that always must pay the price for the sins of Europe. Whereas America has plenty of space. America has plenty of
certainly does. If you go there, it's a vast continent. It's an incredible place. But yeah, certainly just have a lot of space. Even today, it does.
Yeah. And as I said, when I say like pay the price, is because World War II was actually the spur for Zionists to call for initially a kind of two-state solution that would deny the Palestinians the allotted land given to them by sorry, no, I rewind that one. The World War II was what actually started, you could say it was the cause of wars that would later come between Palestinians and the Zionists in the mandate of Palestine, because initially the Zionists were hoping for gradual immigration to the point they became a majority, but when the mandate ended in 1948, the population was still 2/3 Arab, and so you couldn't create a state of Israel with a population where the 2/3 are Arab, and even in the lands which were partitioned by the UN, it was 40% Arab, which is a large minority, and so this would lead to Zionists having to kind of accelerate their plans, and basically would lead to the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, basically. So. Yeah, and that's anyway. But therefore that's when I say that this meant that the Palestinians would pay the price. It was that, which is the escalation of the Zionist project, because they were hoping that gradually there would be more and more immigration over many more decades, and until Palestinians would just become a natural minority, and so would be fine. But when time was up, and World War II had tons of immigrants needing to be settled somewhere, and the Western countries refusing to let Jewish immigrants in, even though they could have easily absorbed them. The Palestine, a very small country, the pressure was increased on it to take more immigrants, even though it's a much smaller land than America, than Canada, than many other places. So that was that was it really on that. That was the issue of it, really.
So, just a final question, perhaps. Is there anything you want to say now that you felt you weren't able to express or contribute when you were on the show?
Well, yes. I mean, like, firstly, as I said, Alhamdulillah, I was able to kind of make a few points, correct Douglas Murray, which is always fun, and
always necessary.
Sorry.
Always necessary as well. But yeah.
Indeed, it's constant work, but also to kind of show Piers Morgan's kind of inconsistency, and as I said, I did enjoy being able to kind of show to the world that this question he's been asking for now 2 months almost about, do you condemn Hamas as a terrorist organization, that he didn't know what the definition of terrorism was specifically, and people were quite shocked by that, basically, that he didn't have it to hand. Like, if you've been asking that question, at least you probably have some awareness. You don't have to get a dictionary out necessarily, but I think there was a joke made about this, that the day after, where he said that he's now read up on it now, right? So he was kind of forced to read up. So Piers Morgan's education, that's what maybe he might have benefited from me, basically, from helping him. But the things I wanted to say on the show There were a few other things I wanted to say, which I didn't get to say. I didn't get to elaborate. I did mention there was an individual. I actually did get to mention on the show something I felt was necessary to mention, which was questioning the events of October the 7th. And I referenced a kind of a very esteemed military analyst called Professor Michael Clarke, who's Director General of the Royal United Services Institute. And he's a specialist in obviously history, military analysis, and he's consulted on Sky News. He was consulted by, I think it was Radio 4, I believe. So he's quite reputable. And I mentioned him in the discussion as to Piers. I said, look, I've got him on record, him saying that his analysis of the October the 7th was that Hamas had a military operation. That they didn't intend to kill civilians. They didn't tell their soldiers to kill civilians. In essence, he didn't say they didn't intend, but he just said it was an operation to capture hostages, and they lost control of the operation as soon as it started. They blew holes in the walls of Gaza. Other evidence has come in to show that there were people that came along with, not with them, but kind of after them, looters, opportunists, and others, disgruntled Gazans who've lived in obviously bad conditions for decades, and they came out and they saw this as an opportunity, and they committed some atrocious acts, which there's no justification for, and it's horrific, and maybe even some Hamas fighters possibly might have broken discipline as well. There's evidence to show that what Michael Clarke has said, actually, like he didn't just take this out of thin air, but actually there's evidence. For example, there's records of Israeli eyewitnesses. A Hamas fighter comes into a house and says, "Look, don't worry, we're Muslim. We don't kill civilians." There was a guy who was a security guard in one of the areas, Israeli security guard. He said that it wasn't Hamas that did this. It was these other Gazans that came in right afterwards. After, so the Hamas just kept fighting the security forces and then moving forward. It was these other security guards. There's questions raised about crossfire, again from an Israeli eyewitness who was actually a temporary hostage of Hamas, and she reported that her colleagues got shot accidentally by Israeli security forces coming to rescue them. Just today, there was an article that came out in Haaretz, I believe, which pointed out that the intelligence agencies and officials knew about the attack the day before when having urgent consultation the night before, but no one notified the Nova Festival organizers, the ones of that music festival, to get out of the way, to evacuate, to leave, and others, and many other things. There's captured Hamas fighters were giving an interview. I managed to mention this briefly in the Piers Morgan show. Who, when interviewed by obviously Israeli interrogators, and they were asked, do you believe that women and children, civilians, can be targeted? He said, no, it's forbidden. It's forbidden in Islam. We were taught this in the mosques. We were taught this in the masajid. I say, okay, who controls the religious education in the mosques in Gaza? Right. This is the question we have to ask. So of course it's going to be Hamas, but you contrast that to the recorded sayings of recorded kind of confessions and interrogations of ISIS fighters, and they'll say, yeah, of course you can target civilians in the West, could target civilians, Shia civilians and others, that it's okay. They will say that it's okay to do so they would admit that. But why would Hamas fighters, if they were told that it's okay to kill Jewish civilians, why wouldn't they say the same thing? These are questions that were raised, and so people like Michael Clarke and others said, look, it's, yes, civilians were killed and it's atrocious and horrific, but it might not have been the intent of Hamas. There wasn't their orders. There was a documentation. I was going to mention this in the Piers Morgan show, but I didn't get time. There was a documentation found on the dead body of a Hamas fighter with their mission parameters were given. Their orders were basically on it. And it mentioned nothing about killing civilians. It said basically, attack certain objectives, conquer it, take hostages for negotiation. Right, that's what it said, and that's it. right?
Yeah.
And we know we can rely on that document being most likely true because it was one of the first responders from Israel's side coming,
Yeah.
found it on a dead body of a Hamas fighter and just put it straight on a Telegram group, right?
Yeah.
So whereas we can say, well, that's most likely not a fake document because it was instantly put up very quickly and it's in Arabic and all this stuff pretty quickly. So all these pieces, when you add them together, it looks like I think as Norman Finkelstein described as like the Nat Turner Rebellion. It was a slave rebellion in America by slaves who were brutalized and so on.
Yeah, it's a good analogy.
Like many of those slaves, they rose up against their slave masters, and some of those slaves killed their former masters' women and children and so on and so forth who are innocent because of the brutalization that they received. It doesn't justify it. But if we are going to approach this as criminologists would, and we are trying to understand why people would do certain things or what's happened, it seems to make more sense that yes, Hamas lost control of the operation, and as I said, ISIS will publicly on their platforms back in the day, they would justify and announce that they can kill civilians, Western civilians, Shia civilians, and so on and so forth.
Bin Laden, it was openly said that was possible. So Hamas could have said that. Absolutely, yeah.
And whereas Hamas have publicly said on multiple platforms that they didn't order any killing of civilians multiple times. And I even pointed out in the show that the guy that at the beginning of the show, Piers Morgan showed a clip of a Hamas representative talking to on an Arabic program, saying that we are ready to launch operations against Israel again and again and again until Palestine. Until we reach we get the rights for Palestinians and so on and so forth. And I said, well, that very same guy himself has publicly denied that Hamas ever wanted to target civilians. So how comes when Israel is carpet bombing or saturation bombing Gaza, you take them at their word that they are not targeting civilians, but you don't take Hamas at its word when it says they're not targeting civilians, when if they really believed it was okay to do so, why would they be shy to admit it? I mean, they would be open about it. And of course, there is a narrative there, which is that Palestinian groups such as Hamas and others, they just want to kill every single Jew they can get their hands on, which is the Zionist narrative currently being a popular Zionist narrative currently being spun. And I was going to point out that both in the 1988, the infamous 1988 charter of Hamas, they mention, and I've mentioned it before in discussions, that they envision Palestine under Islamic law, and it's one united Palestine, but they say that Jews, Muslims, and Christians can live peacefully together under Islamic law, right? So I cite this mainly to point out that this does not sound like it fits this narrative that they just hate Jews and want to kill all Jews. Likewise, their 2017 charter, this revised version, is it expressly makes the case that we're not fighting Zionists because they're Jews. We're fighting because of the land they took and so we just want that land back and so on and so forth. And there's also, of course, Sheikh Yassin, who's it's called the spiritual founder of or spiritual leader, of Hamas, who was on record saying, I mean, there's a video clip of him basically saying that he's responding to the Zionist narrative against him, saying that they just hate Jews and want to kill all the Jews, and says, look, Jews are a people of deen, a people of religion. He said, we love people of religion, right? It's not, we don't fight them for that. We fight them because they took the land. Now, the reason why I want to mention this, and I feel it's important, is not because of to just kind of talk about Hamas for its own sake, but because if we're going to talk about the conflict there and we want to seek a solution, we have to be factually accurate about the people's motivations, about their grievances, and about what happened. So I would say that you can't really deny that civilians were killed in October the 7th. Israeli civilians were killed, right? There's no denying that. There's bodies everywhere. There's pictures of it and so on and so forth. We have to be factually accurate that there was an atrocity was committed. But likewise, we have to also be factually accurate in not misportraying Hamas or Fatah or any other the groups of the Palestinians, their motives, that they just want to kill all Jews, they want to do a Holocaust, when no, they've always been consistent in what they've been saying. And if we want to find a solution to resolve injustices there and to address people's grievances, we have to be factually accurate. So that's what I really kind of wanted to say. And the last point was about Abdul Wahid himself. I think we'll end on that point because the whole point of the show was about Dr. Abdul Wahid. And I wanted to say that, one of the right-wing tropes is they say that, these immigrants come to the UK, come to the West, and they just live on social welfare handouts and pay and so on and so forth, and they don't contribute anything beneficial. And yet they were complaining that Dr. Abdul Wahid has a job and is working for 25 years. And what I wanted to say to Douglas Murray before he left, and obviously, I didn't even know he was going to leave. I thought he was going to be there for the whole discussion. He just ran off. Right. I was going to say to him, maybe I'll say it through this camera lens, right? To Douglas Murray, how many lives have you saved, Douglas? You say that Dr. Abdul Wahid hasn't contributed any good to this country. How many lives have you saved? The only thing he's ever contributed to England is to publish books and get paid a lot of money exploiting people's hatred of immigrants and other people. He hasn't contributed. How many lives has he saved? Not a single one. How many lives has Dr. Abdul Wahid saved? How many British lives has Dr. Abdul Wahid saved through his consultations, his evaluations, his spotting things, cancer early and getting treatment for people, and a whole number of it? How many lives has he made easier and from pain and suffering by getting them the right treatments they need? I think if we judge the contribution of Douglas Murray to the contribution of Dr. Abdul Wahid, and we were judging who stays and who leaves, it won't be Dr. Abdul Wahid who deserves to leave.
And of course, the doctor is an NHS doctor. He's not chosen to go private and make lots of money in Harley Street in London here, to kind of exploit the rich. No, he worked in the public sector, which is obviously much less well paid for many, many years, as you say. So there's proof there that he's a man of public service rather than graft or self-enrichment.
Yeah. So that's it. I mean, they want to kick out doctors and make Muslims. They want to make us jobless, and at the same time complain that we take money from social welfare. Like, make your mind up. Can we have jobs, or should we take social, welfare? So which you don't like us doing. So make your mind up. Of course, I'm concerned they might say we want you just to leave, whether consensually or not.
Calling their bluff on that, they might give the wrong answer. But I know what you're trying to say. It was a good point, actually, Abdullah. Good point. Well, thank you very much. And just finally, I think you're on a website, have you? Advocateforpalestine.com, is that right?
Yes. So, I mean, I have a normal blog website, which is called Abdullah Al-Andalusi.com. Bit of a long one. But I am starting up a course after seeing what's been happening in Gaza. And I have done a course for the Quran Institute before, which was a Palestine advocacy course, which was kind of a basic one on history of Palestine, A to Z, with some discussions of some of the arguments by Zionists and where Palestinian advocacy can address those. But I felt like after the recent events, Muslims need to, en masse, and even non-Muslims too, will welcome, to become expert in advocating for Palestine. There's a lot of detailed technical knowledge that many Muslims don't know, many non-Muslims don't know. And I decided I want to aim to kind of have thousands of people trained up with advanced knowledge, such that they could confidently stand in front of even Alan Dershowitz and be able to not be surprised by anything he says, and to give effective counter arguments that completely stump him. So it's Advocate for Palestine. So Advocate for Palestine.com,
is that right?
.com. Yeah, advocateforpalestine.com, nice and simple. And inshallah, you can go there, just sign up your email address, and inshallah, to get notifications of what, when the course will begin and what it will entail and so on and so forth, inshallah.
Okay, well, obviously that link is in the description below, so do click on that, sign up and become expert. It's very important that more and more people become very knowledgeable and able to refute lies and misinformation, disinformation, and just sheer ignorance. So that's fantastic work there. So thank you very much indeed, Abdullah Al-Andalusi, from London. We're both here in London today, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, I can just see you. Just see you down the road.
Yeah, we're actually in the same room. People don't realise we're just pretending to be in different places. No, we're not. So thank you very much indeed, Abdullah. And I think we're going to be back next week, inshallah, for a related but different theme. So I'll mention that on social media beforehand. But until then, thank you very much, Abdullah. Assalamu alaikum to you.
Barakallahu feekum wa alaikum assalam.